The past is never dead. A ghost operative is forced to confront his own history while navigating a labyrinth of modern political and criminal motives, only to find that a rescued innocent cannot wash away the sins of the father or his own. Blood Ransom. Chapter 1. The Gulfstream G650 didn't just land at Dulles. It settled onto the tarmac like a bird of prey that had decided, for the moment, not to kill anything. It was sleek and white, and had the flag of the Republic of Kando painted on its tail, a stylized sunburst of green and gold that looked optimistic and entirely out of place on a damp Tuesday afternoon in Virginia. Special Agent Harris of the Diplomatic Security Service watched it taxi toward the designated hard stand, his hands shoved in the pockets of a trench coat that felt too warm. He'd been doing this for 15 years. He'd met kings who were broke, prime ministers who were drunks, and ambassadors who were spies. He thought he'd seen it all. But he'd never met a man who had personally shot his way into the presidential palace and then spent the next 20 years trying to convince the world he'd been invited. "Here we go," said the Secret Service agent standing next to him, a man named Cutler with a jaw so square it looked like it had been milled from a block of granite. "Let's see if their guys play nice." "They won't," Harris said. The jet's door opened, and the stairs lowered with a quiet hydraulic hiss. The first man out wasn't the president. It was Colonel Jallo, head of the Kanden Presidential Guard. He was a big man, broad and thick, poured into a dark suit that was at least one size too small and probably cost more than Harris' car. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been used to stop punches, and his eyes scanned the tarmac, the rooftops, the distant trees, seeing threats everywhere. He paused at the top of the stairs, a human roadblock. "He looks happy," Cutler muttered. "He's a long way from home," Harris said. Two more Kanden guards followed, clones of Jallo in ill-fitting suits, their hands held stiffly at their sides, their jackets unbuttoned. They positioned themselves at the bottom of the stairs. Only then did President Jomo Okoro appear in the doorway. The man was a study in transformation. On the news, in front of the UN, he was all smiles and tailored Savile Row suits, talking about trade deals and democratic reforms. He looked like a statesman. But now, framed in the doorway of his private jet, the veneer was gone. He was tall and lean, with a stillness that was unnerving. His eyes, small and dark, missed nothing. They were the eyes of a man who knew how to wait in a jungle with a machete. He saw Harris. He saw Cutler. He saw the sniper team he knew would be on the roof of the terminal. He saw it all in a single, sweeping glance. Then the mask slipped back on. The shoulders relaxed, a warm, charismatic smile spread across his face, and he started down the stairs, every inch the visiting dignitary. The last person off the plane was the reason they were all there, the reason the State Department was willing to roll out the red carpet for a man like Okoro. His daughter, Amara. She was 22, dressed in a pair of tailored slacks and a silk blouse that probably cost more than the ill-fitting suits of her father's bodyguards. She had a Georgetown master's degree and an accent that was more Northern Virginia than West Africa. She moved with an easy grace, a confidence that her father's men, with all their coiled menace, completely lacked. She was the bridge. The pretty, articulate, Western-educated face of a nation trying to wash the blood off its hands. She smiled at Harris as she reached the bottom of the stairs. It was a genuine smile, not the calculated one her father wore. "Agent Harris. I'm Amara Okoro. It's a pleasure to meet you. My father is very much looking forward to a productive visit." "Welcome to Washington, Ms. Okoro," Harris said, shaking her hand. President Okoro was already shaking hands with the Deputy Secretary of State, a man whose smile was even more practiced than his own. The cameras were flashing. It was all very civilized. The problems started when they got to the cars. "The president and his daughter will ride in the lead vehicle," Colonel Jallo said to Cutler. It wasn't a request. His English was thick but precise. "My men will provide close escort." Cutler didn't even blink. "The president will ride in the armored Cadillac we have provided. His daughter will be in the vehicle behind him." I'll be in the front seat of the president's car. My team will handle the escort. Your men can ride in the follow car. Jallo's eyes narrowed. That is not acceptable. I am responsible for the president's life. Not in this country, you're not, Cutler said, his voice still perfectly level. In this country, I am. He's my protectee. You're a guest. You can either get in the follow car, or you can wait here for the next flight back to Kando. Your choice. Jallo took a step closer to Cutler. He was a head taller and 50 pounds heavier. He was used to people doing what he said. Harris saw the colonel's right hand twitch, a subtle movement toward the bulge under his jacket. Cutler saw it too. He didn't move a muscle, but two of his agents, who had been standing casually by the limousine, suddenly weren't casual anymore. They had shifted their weight, their hands disappearing inside their own coats. The air on the tarmac crackled. It was President Okoro who broke the tension. He put a hand on Jallo's arm. "Colonel," he said, his voice a soft, dangerous purr. "These men are professionals. We will follow their protocol. We are guests in their house." Jallo looked like he had swallowed poison. He stared at Cutler for a long moment, his eyes promising murder, before giving a stiff, formal bow to his president. "As you wish, Mr. President." He turned and stalked toward the follow car, barking orders at his men in his native tongue. Okoro turned to Cutler, his smile back in place. "My apologies, gentlemen. My chief of security is zealous. He loves his country. And his president." "We appreciate his zeal, Mr. President," Cutler said, opening the door to the armored Cadillac. Amara got into the second car with Harris. As the door closed, she let out a long, slow breath. "I apologize for that," she said, looking out the window as her father's car pulled away. "Colonel Jallo still thinks he's fighting a war." "He's just doing his job, ma'am," Harris said, the professional diplomat. "His job used to be shooting people who disagreed with my father," she said, her voice quiet. She turned from the window and looked at Harris. "Now his job is to look intimidating in a suit. He's not very good at it." The motorcade pulled out of the airport, a cocoon of black Suburbans and armored limousines. Harris watched the Camden follow car in his rearview mirror. It was staying too close to the president's vehicle, crowding the Secret Service escort car behind it. They were still trying to play games. Harris felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't going to be a simple visit. It was a clash of worlds. The brutal, direct world of men like Okoro and Jallo, and the layered, protocol-driven world of Washington. And he and Amara were caught right in the middle. Chapter 2. The DuPont Circle Hotel was the kind of place that sold quiet as a luxury item. The lobby was a hushed cathedral of marble and dark wood, where well-dressed people spoke in low, confidential tones. But the quiet was a lie. Outside, on the circle itself, a different kind of noise was building. Special Agent Harris stood near the entrance to the hotel's private lounge, the Pembroke, trying to look relaxed. He wasn't. Through the thick plate glass of the lobby doors, he could see the protesters. There were maybe 50 of them, a mix of college kids who looked like they'd get lost without their phone's GPS, and older, angrier-looking people in mismatched camo. They carried signs with slogans like "No deals with dictators" and "Kando bleeds for Okoro SGRED." "Rent a mob," Cutler, the Secret Service agent, said into his wrist mic, his eyes never leaving the crowd. "Standard stuff. D.C. Metro has a line set up. They won't get near the hotel." Harris wasn't so sure. The protest felt organized. Too organized. They weren't just chanting. They were moving, testing the police line, creating pockets of noise and confusion. Inside the lounge, it was another world. President Okoro sat in a high-backed armchair, sipping a glass of sparkling water. Amara sat opposite him, scrolling through something on her phone, a faint line of tension around her mouth. Colonel Jallo and two of his men stood by the doors, their bodies rigid, their eyes scanning the room, as if they expected assassins to repel from the chandeliers. "You should put that away," Okoro said to his daughter, his voice a low rumble. "You are here to represent our country, not to play with your toys." "I'm reviewing the talking points for your meeting with the Congressional Trade Committee, Father," Amara said without looking up. "The one you haven't read yet." Okoro's smile was thin. "I do not need talking points to speak about my own country. I am the talking points." "Of course," Amara said, her voice cool. She finally looked up from her phone, and her eyes met Harris for a second. There was a flash of something in them, frustration, weariness, before she masked it. The sound from outside grew louder, a chant rising in volume. Cutler spoke into his mic again. "Lobby team, what's your status? Keep that entrance clear." That's when it happened. It started with a series of loud pops from the street, like firecrackers. The protesters surged forward against the police line. At the same instant, 2 of the hotel's fire alarms went off, their shrill, piercing shriek cutting through the lounge's quiet ambiance. Colonel Jallo and his men drew their weapons, massive semi-automatic pistols that looked absurd in the genteel room. "Stay with the president," Jallo barked. Cutler was already moving. "Lock it down," he yelled into his mic. "This is a diversion." He was right. But the diversion wasn't just outside. The double doors to the lounge burst open. It wasn't a frontal assault. It was smoke. 3 canisters, the professional kind used by SWAT teams, rolled into the room, instantly filling the space with a thick, choking white fog. It didn't smell like fire. It smelled of chemicals. Disorienting. Harris drew his own weapon, a Sig Sauer P229, and grabbed Amara's arm. "Down. Get down." He pulled her to the floor, behind a heavy sofa. The room was chaos. He could hear Jallo shouting in his native tongue. He heard the thump of bodies hitting the floor. The smoke was so thick he couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. Then he heard new sounds through the smoke. The soft thud of rubber-soled boots on a thick carpet. The whisper of fabric. These were not the sounds of panicked security guards. They were the sounds of professionals. He felt a tug on Amara's arm. He tightened his grip. "No," she cried out, her voice muffled. A shape materialized out of the smoke. A figure in black from head to toe, wearing a gas mask with dark insect-like lenses. There was no skin showing. No identifying marks. The figure didn't have a gun. It had a taser. It fired. The electricity hit Harris like a mule kick, a white-hot explosion of pain that seized every muscle in his body. His gun clattered to the floor. His grip on Amara's arm was ripped away. He collapsed, his body convulsing, his vision tunneling into a pinpoint of light before winking out into blackness. The entire event, from the smoke canisters to Harris hitting the floor, took less than 15 seconds. When the smoke began to clear, Cutler and his agents were the first to recover. They had been guarding the president, forming a human wall around him. Okoro was on the floor, unhurt but furious, his Savile Row suit covered in dust. Colonel Jallo and his 2 men were on the floor too. They weren't shot. They were groaning, clutching their heads. They'd been hit with something, gas flashbangs, something that had bypassed their brute force and attacked their senses. Harris was just coming to, his body feeling like one giant throbbing bruise. He pushed himself up, his head swimming. The first thing he saw was the empty space on the floor beside him. "Amara," he croaked. Cutler was already scanning the room, his weapon up. "Where is she? Does anyone have eyes on the daughter?" The room was a wreck. Overturned tables, shattered glasses. The smoke was thinning, sucked into the ventilation system. But Amara was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, other than the unconscious security men. No blood. No spent casings. The windows were intact. The main doors were the only way in or out. "They came through the main doors," Cutler said, stating the obvious. "And they went out the same way." "How?" Harris demanded, getting to his feet. "The lobby is full of my people. And yours. They ran out into the lobby. It was in a similar state of chaos. Smoke still hung in the air. A few hotel guests were coughing, their eyes streaming. But there were no bodies. No kidnappers. Cutler grabbed the agent in charge of his lobby team. What did you see? Nothing, the agent said, his face pale. The alarms went off, then the smoke. It came from the service corridors. We thought it was a fire. We were trying to evacuate the guests. We didn't see anyone come out of the lounge. They had used the hotel's own fire suppression system, or something that looked like it, to cover their entrance and their exit. They had used the protest as an auditory diversion and the smoke as a visual one. They had moved through the chaos they created like ghosts. President Jomo Okoro strode out of the lounge, his face a mask of cold fury. Colonel Jallo was right behind him, his face a thundercloud, his hand clutching the pistol he had never had a chance to fire. Okoro surveyed the scene, his dark eyes taking in the smoke, the panicked agents, the empty space where his daughter should have been. He walked over to Harris, his movements stiff, controlled. He didn't shout. He didn't scream. His voice was low, a whisper that was more terrifying than any yell. "Where," he said, "is my daughter?" Harris had no answer. He just stared at the empty doorway, the knot in his stomach now a block of ice. They hadn't just taken her. They had vanished with her. No ransom. No note. No trace. Chapter 3. An hour after the smoke cleared, the quiet of the DuPont Circle Hotel had been replaced by a new kind of noise. It was the sound of men in dark suits speaking into their wrists, the crackle of multiple radio frequencies interfering with each other, and the low hum of a bureaucratic turf war getting ready to go hot. The lobby had been cleared of civilians, and was now a staging ground for the kind of multi-agency cluster a DC kidnapping guarantees. Special Agent Harris stood near the entrance to the cordoned-off lounge, feeling the last of the taser's ghost electricity twitching in his muscles. He was watching three men who were pretending not to be at war with each other. The first was Special Agent in Charge Davenport of the FBI's hostage rescue team. He had flown in from Quantico on a helicopter that had landed on a closed-off street outside, and he carried himself with the serene arrogance of a man who believes he is the final word on any subject. He wore a suit that cost $2,000 and looked like he was about to give a press conference. The second was D.C. Metro Homicide Detective K. Ron Washington. He was a big man, built like a retired linebacker with a shaved head and a salt-and-pepper goatee. He wore a rumpled tweed jacket that had seen better decades, and he was chewing on an unlit cigar, his eyes taking in the scene with a deep, profound weariness. This was his city, his crime scene, and a bunch of feds in shiny shoes were treating him like part of the furniture. The third was Cutler, the Secret Service agent, who was just pissed off. His job was to protect the body, and the body was safe. But the kidnapping of the daughter had happened on his watch, in his protective bubble, and it was a stain on his otherwise perfect record. "The egress route is clean," Davenport was saying, looking at a tablet his assistant was holding. They went out the service entrance at the rear of the hotel. Vanished into the alley. "We have a preliminary on the smoke canisters. Military grade. Non-lethal. Very professional." "No kidding," Detective Washington said, taking the dead cigar out of his mouth. "They walked in here, tasered a federal agent, gassed a room full of foreign bodyguards, snatched the daughter of a head of state, and walked out without anyone seeing a damn thing. I'd say that's professional. Now, if you don't mind, Sack Davenport, I'd like to get my crime scene unit in here before you boys trample all over the evidence." Davenport gave Washington a smile that didn't have any warmth in it. "This is a federal matter now, Detective. Kidnapping of a foreign official on U.S. soil. That puts it squarely in my jurisdiction." "The hell it does," Washington shot back. "This is a crime scene in the District of Columbia. That makes it mine. You're here to assist. You can assist by getting your people the hell back so my people can work." My people are working, Davenport said smoothly. HRT is already canvassing the neighborhood, pulling traffic cam footage. We're running facial recognition against the protesters. This is our wheelhouse. Your wheelhouse is kicking in doors in Montana, Washington said. My wheelhouse is finding a needle in a haystack in a city that's nothing but needles and haystacks. I need to talk to the hotel staff. The valets, the kitchen workers, the maids. Someone saw something. All witnesses will be interviewed by the Bureau, Davenport said, his voice final. Harris decided to step in before they drew their weapons. Gentlemen, he said, his voice raspy. We have a bigger problem. The victim's father. Davenport and Washington both looked at him. He's upstairs in the presidential suite with his security team, Harris continued. He's refusing to speak to anyone. He's locked himself in. He's a witness, Davenport said. He doesn't get to refuse. He's the head of a sovereign nation who is here as a guest of the United States government, Harris corrected him. He gets to do whatever the hell he wants. And right now, what he wants is to not talk to us. Upstairs, the hallway outside the presidential suite looked like a border checkpoint. Two of Cutler's Secret Service agents stood on one side, looking tense. On the other side, Colonel Jallo and his men stood in front of the suite's double doors, their hands inside their jackets, their faces carved from stone. A man in a gray, perfectly tailored suit that screamed Langley was trying to reason with Jallo. His name was Miles, the CIA's D.C. station chief. He had the calm, reasonable air of a man who could order a drone strike and then go home and worry about his lawn. Colonel, Miles was saying, his voice patient. I'm not here as part of the investigation. I'm here to offer the full resources of my agency to President Okoro. We have assets, intelligence capabilities that the FBI doesn't. We want to help find his daughter. The president does not require your help, Jallo said, his voice a low growl. Perhaps you could just let him know I'm here, Miles suggested. The door to the suite opened, and President Jomo Okoro stood there. He had taken off his suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his expensive white shirt. He looked at Miles, and his eyes were not the eyes of a statesman. They were the eyes of a warlord. You are CIA, Okoro said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Mr. President, Miles said. I'm here to offer our sincerest apologies for this breach of security and to extend any and all assistance. Assistance? Okoro cut him off. He took a step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You offer me assistance. That is a very American word. It sounds like help. But it often means something else, doesn't it, Mr. Miles? It means you want something. Access. Influence. A foothold. Sir, I can assure you our only interest is the safe return of your daughter. Okoro laughed. It was a short, ugly sound. Your only interest. Your agency has had an interest in my country for 20 years. An interest in our coltan, our diamonds. An interest in who sits in the presidential palace. I remember Operation Sun Devil. Do you, Mr. Miles? When your predecessors armed the rebels who tried to kill me in my own home. You called that assistance too. Miles's calm expression didn't flicker, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. That was a different time, Mr. President. A different administration. It is always a different administration, Okoro said, stepping closer until he was inches from the CIA man's face. But it is always the same agency. With the same interests. You think this is a coincidence? That my daughter is taken, here in your capital, a week before I am to sign a trade agreement with China instead of your American mining companies? You are either complicit or you are incompetent. Either way, you are useless to me. He turned to his head of security. Colonel, remove this man from my hallway. Jallo smiled, a terrifying sight. He took a step toward Miles. Cutler's agents moved instantly, stepping between the CIA chief and the Kandon guards. "That's not going to happen," Cutler's lead agent said, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. Jallo's men put their hands on their own weapons. For a second, the hallway was a tableau of imminent violence, a silent, high-stakes standoff between two sets of armed men a long way from home. Harris, who had come up the stairs just in time to see it unfold, felt his phone vibrate. He pulled it out. It was a secure line, a number he didn't recognize. He answered it. "Harris." The voice on the other end was his boss, the Deputy Secretary of State. He sounded tired. "What the hell is going on up there, Harris?" "It's a jurisdictional nightmare, sir. And Okoro just accused the CIA of kidnapping his daughter and ordered his men to throw the station chief out." There was a long sigh on the other end of the line. "Of course he did. Listen to me. The White House is spinning. Okoro is threatening to go public. He's refusing all official channels. He says he doesn't trust us." "I can't say I blame him," Harris said. "He's making a back-channel play," his boss continued, ignoring him. "He's asking for a contractor. Someone completely off the books. A ghost. We need to get ahead of this, control the narrative. There's a man. Carver's office is handling it. They have someone on standby." Harris' blood went cold. He knew who Carver's office used for jobs like this. The standoff in the hallway was still happening, a frozen moment of international diplomacy at gunpoint. Jallo was staring down the Secret Service agent, a thin smile on his face. He was enjoying this. Chapter 4. The apartment was in Rosslyn, Virginia, on the 32nd floor of a glass tower that looked down on the Potomac and the monuments of Washington, D.C. It had no personality. The furniture was minimalist and uncomfortable, the art on the walls was abstract and meaningless, and the refrigerator contained nothing but 6 bottles of Fiji water. It was a place for people who didn't exist, a sterile box in the sky that could be wiped clean in an hour, leaving no trace anyone had ever been there. It suited Brill perfectly. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the traffic move across the Key Bridge. He wasn't admiring the view. He was watching the reflections in the glass, seeing the entire room behind him, the hallway, the door. He had been here for 2 days, waiting. The call had come on a burner phone, a single sentence from a voice he recognized, the Arlington office. 48 hours. Then the line went dead. So he came, and he waited. He heard the elevator ding softly out in the main hall. A moment later, he heard the quiet click of a keycard in the apartment door. The man who entered was named Carver. He wasn't a spy or a soldier. He was a lawyer. He worked for a firm in D.C. that had only 3 names on its letterhead, but occupied 4 floors of a building on K Street. The firm specialized in problems. International problems. The kind that couldn't be solved in a courtroom or a boardroom. Carver was the man who managed the firm's more kinetic assets. He was in his late 50s, with silver hair cut with military precision, and a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He carried a thin leather briefcase. He closed the door behind him and set the briefcase on a glass coffee table. He didn't seem surprised to see Brill standing by the window. "I see you got my message," Carver said. His voice was dry, like rustling paper. "I'm here," Brill said. Carver opened his briefcase. He didn't take out files or papers. He took out a tablet. He swiped the screen on and set it on the table, turning it to face Brill. "I assume you've seen the news." "I don't watch the news," Brill said. "A wise policy," Carver said. "It's mostly fiction anyway. Here are the facts." He tapped the screen. An image of Amara Okoro appeared, a smiling, professional headshot. Amara Okoro, 22 years old. Daughter of President Jomo Okoro of the Republic of Kando. She was taken from the DuPont Circle Hotel approximately 3 hours ago. He swiped the screen. A picture of the chaotic hotel lobby, filled with agents, appeared. The kidnapping was professional. Smoke, diversion, non-lethal takedown of her security detail, including a diplomatic security agent. They were in and out in under 2 minutes. No witnesses who saw a face. No vehicle identified. They vanished. Brill didn't say anything. He just watched the screen. The situation, Carver continued, is what the State Department politely refers to as a multi-jurisdictional cluster fumble. He said the word with a patrician distaste, as if it were something he'd stepped in. The FBI's hostage rescue team has claimed federal jurisdiction. The D.C. Metro Police, whose city it is, are telling them to go to hell. The Secret Service is trying to figure out how their protective bubble got popped, and the CIA is trying to convince everyone they didn't do it. Did they? Brill asked. His first question. Carver almost smiled. President Okoro certainly thinks so. He has a long and unpleasant history with the agency. He's accusing them of orchestrating the whole thing to kill a trade deal he's about to sign with the Chinese. He has locked himself in his suite and is refusing to cooperate with any official U.S. law enforcement. So the investigation is dead, Brill stated. Worse than dead, Carver corrected. It's a pissing contest with a hostage in the middle. The FBI and the D.C. cops will spend the next 72 hours fighting over evidence and leaking things to the press to make the other guys look bad. By the time they get their act together, the girl will either be dead or in another country. He looked up from the tablet, his pale blue eyes meeting Brill's. Which is why we're having this conversation. He asked for a contractor, Brill said. Through an intermediary, yes, Carver confirmed. A Swiss banker who handles his less official accounts. The request was specific. Someone with no ties to any government. Someone who can operate outside the lines. Someone who can deliver a result, not a report. What's the result he wants? His daughter back. Alive. And the people who took her. Carver gave a slight, elegant shrug. The president is a practical man. He understands that some problems can only be solved by creating other, more permanent problems for the people who caused them. Extreme prejudice, Brill said. That's the legal term the president's banker used, yes, Carver said. He swiped the screen again. A list of names appeared. These are the likely suspects, according to the president. The list is long. He's not a popular man. Brill looked at the list. It was a who's who of people who might want a man like Okoro dead or destabilized. Exiled political rivals. Islamist rebels operating on his northern border. Corporate mining interests who lost out on the Chinese deal. Even a few domestic American hate groups who don't like the color of his skin or his trade policies. It could be any of them, Brill said. Or none of them. Precisely, Carver said. The FBI will spend a month building suspect profiles and applying for warrants. You don't have that luxury. You have to assume they're all guilty until proven innocent. You have to kick over all the rocks and see what crawls out. Brill was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. He was running the problem, seeing the angles, the choke points, the paths of violence. There's one more thing, Carver said, his voice dropping slightly. A complication. The president's history. The civil war that brought him to power was particularly bloody. The old government hired foreign mercenaries to help them. A group called Executive Options. Brill's expression didn't change by so much as a flicker, but something in his eyes went very still. The president mentioned them specifically, Carver continued, oblivious. He said they were butchers. He said he would never forget the faces of the men who fought for the corrupt regime he overthrew. It's just background. Something for you to be aware of. The man holds a grudge. Carver closed the tablet. He stood up and walked to his briefcase, taking out a slim, unmarked credit card and a set of car keys. He placed them on the table. The card has a revolving limit of $100,000. The keys are for a Ford Explorer in the garage downstairs, level G4. It's clean. There's a bag in the back with some initial supplies. The rest you'll acquire as needed." He looked at Brill. "The fee has already been wired to your account. Your job starts now." Brill didn't look at the card or the keys. He walked away from the window and went into the apartment's small, sterile bedroom. He opened the closet. Inside was a single duffel bag. His bag. He took it out and laid it on the bed. Carver watched him from the doorway. He saw Brill take out a worn leather holster, a suppressed pistol, a roll of garrote wire, and a set of lockpicks. He was a man preparing for his trade, like a carpenter laying out his tools. Brill zipped up the bag, slung it over his shoulder, and walked back into the living room. He picked up the keys from the table, ignoring the credit card. He didn't look at Carver. He just walked to the door. His hand was on the knob when Carver spoke again. "Brill, one last thing. The girl. Amara. She's not her father. By all accounts, she's intelligent, compassionate, and innocent in all this." Brill stopped, his back still to Carver. "There are no innocents," he said, and opened the door and walked out, leaving Carver alone in the silent, empty room. Chapter 5. The Embassy of the Republic of Kando wasn't on Embassy Row. It was a standalone limestone fortress in Kalorama, surrounded by a 10-foot wrought iron fence tipped with sharpened spikes. It looked less like a diplomatic mission, and more like the home of a man who expected visitors to arrive with rocket launchers. The flag of Kando hung from a pole out front, its green and gold sunburst looking garish against the old money stone. Brill didn't go to the front gate. He sat in the passenger seat of a black Lincoln Town car with tinted windows, driven by a man in a dark suit who hadn't said a word since picking him up. The man was one of Carver's. He drove past the embassy, circled the block, and pulled into a service alley behind it. A steel gate buzzed open before they reached it. Colonel Jallo was waiting for them in the underground garage. He wasn't wearing his tight suit anymore. He was dressed in black tactical pants and a tight-fitting polo shirt that showed the bulge of a pistol holstered under his arm, and the hard lines of a man who spent more time in a gym than behind a desk. Two of his guards, dressed identically, stood behind him. They looked at Brill as he got out of the car, their eyes flat and hostile. "He is waiting," Jallo said to Brill, his voice a low rumble. He didn't offer a handshake. He just turned and led the way to a private elevator. They rode up in silence. The elevator didn't have music. It just had the low hum of the motor and the thick, palpable animosity of the three Kandan guards. Brill stood at the back, relaxed, his hands at his sides. He watched Jallo's reflection in the polished brass of the elevator doors. The colonel was watching him back. The elevator opened directly into President Okoro's private office. The room was a jarring mix of two worlds. The walls were lined with priceless West African art, carved masks with hollow eyes, intricate tapestries, a pair of ceremonial spears crossed over the fireplace. But the furniture was gaudy, modern Italian, all white leather and chrome, the kind of thing a man with new money and no taste buys to prove he has it. President Jomo Okoro stood by a large window overlooking the manicured garden. He held a crystal tumbler, half full of what looked like whiskey. He didn't turn when they entered. "Leave us," Okoro said. Jallo hesitated. "Mr. President, it is not wise." "You have surrounded this building with your men, Colonel," Okoro said, his voice soft but carrying an edge of iron. "You have checked this man for weapons. If he can get to me in here, then you have already failed me. Now leave us." Jallo's jaw tightened. He shot Brill a final, venomous look before he and his men backed out of the room, closing the heavy oak doors behind them. Okoro turned from the window. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes appraising Brill over the rim of the glass. He gestured with the tumbler toward a white leather chair. "Sit." Brill didn't move. "I'm fine." Okoro smiled, a thin, humorless stretching of his lips. Of course you are. He walked over to a large, chrome-legged desk and sat down, placing the tumbler on a leather coaster. My intermediary, the man who pays you, tells me you are the best at what you do. He tells me you are a ghost. That you solve problems. I find things, Brill said. Yes. You find things. Okoro leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. 20 years ago, during our country's struggle for liberation, I found many things. I found traitors in my camp. I found caches of weapons supplied by foreign interests. And I found men who looked like you, hiding in the jungle. Brill's face was a mask of indifference. He just stood there, a silent, waiting presence. They were not American, Okoro continued, his voice a low, conversational purr. They were British, South African, Rhodesian. Mercenaries. Hired by the corrupt government I was replacing. They called themselves executive options. A very polite name for a group of killers. He paused, watching Brill's eyes, looking for a flicker, a shadow, anything. He found nothing. They were very good at their jobs, Okoro said. They knew how to use the jungle. They knew how to kill from 1,000 yards. One of them killed my brother. At the Battle of the Red River. Shot him from a ridgeline no one thought a man could reach. He took another sip of his whiskey. My brother was a good man. A better man than me. He was to be the face of the new Kando. The one who would talk to the UN and charm the bankers. I was just the fist. Brill remained silent. The story wasn't for him. It was a test. A warning. I hunted the man who killed him, Okoro said, his voice dropping even lower. For 3 days. Through the jungle. I found him by a stream, washing my brother's blood from his hands. He was a white man with pale eyes. Like yours. Okoro leaned back in his chair. I never learned his name. He did not have time to tell it to me. The threat hung in the air, thick and heavy as the humid jungle Okoro was describing. You have a list, Brill said, his voice cutting through the tension, bringing the conversation back to the present, to the job. Okoro seemed to deflate slightly. The intimidation hadn't worked. He had shown his teeth, and the ghost hadn't even blinked. He opened a drawer in his desk and took out a single sheet of heavy cream-colored stationery. It was folded in half. My daughter is not like me, Okoro said, his voice changing, a hint of genuine pain creeping in. She was raised here in your country. She believes in things I do not. Dialogue. Compromise. The basic goodness of people. He pushed the paper across the desk. She is the only part of my life that is not stained. Do you understand? I understand the objective, Brill said. Okoro nodded. Yes. The objective. He tapped the folded paper. This is a list of my enemies. The ones with the resources and the hatred to do something like this. Some are in my country. Some are in Europe. And some, I am sure, are right here in your city. Brill walked to the desk. He picked up the paper. He didn't open it. He just held it. The men who took her, Okoro said, his voice turning hard again. I do not care about their politics or their reasons. I do not want them arrested. I do not want them brought to justice. You want them gone, Brill finished for him. I want them erased, Okoro corrected. I want their families to forget their names. I want their houses to burn, and the ground where they stood to be salted. He stood up and walked back to the window, his back to Brill. It was a dismissal. Find my daughter. Bring her back to me. And then you will disappear. I never want to see your face again. I never want to hear your name. If I do, I will assume you are a loose end. And I am a man who cleans up loose ends. Brill didn't reply. He turned and walked to the heavy oak doors. He opened one and stepped out into the hallway. Colonel Jallo and his men were standing there waiting. They had been listening at the door. Jallo looked at Brill, then at the folded paper in his hand, then back at Brill's face. He was looking for some sign of fear, of intimidation. He found none. Brill walked past them toward the elevator, his footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. He pushed the call button. As he waited for the doors to open, he unfolded the paper. It was a long list, handwritten in a tight, angry script. He started at the top. The first name was an exiled general living in Paris. The second was the CEO of a Canadian mining company. The third was a name he recognized. Simon. The leader of his old mercenary unit, Executive Options. The elevator doors slid open. Brill folded the paper, stuck it in his pocket, and stepped inside. Chapter 6. Brill didn't go back to the sterile apartment in Roslyn. That place had served its purpose. It was already a ghost itself. He took the Ford Explorer from the garage, a bland, anonymous vehicle that was perfect for disappearing into the suburban sprawl of the D.C. metro area. He drove south, away from the city, and checked into a motel in Springfield that rented rooms by the hour and didn't ask for ID if you paid in cash. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. He laid out the contents of the bag Carver had left him. It was a starter kit for a man who needed to cause trouble. A set of clean Virginia license plates. A police scanner. A high-end laptop in a hardened case. A satellite phone. And a Glock 19 with 3 full magazines still in its factory grease. He field-stripped the Glock on the stained bedspread, cleaning it with a rag from his own kit, his movements economical and precise. He worked the action until it was smooth as glass. He sat down with the laptop and the list President Okoro had given him. The list was a problem. It was too long, a shotgun blast of potential suspects scattered across 3 continents. He needed a place to start. He started with proximity. Who was close enough to have done it? The first name on the list that was within driving distance was Jean-Pierre Ngoma, the former Minister of Finance for the Republic of Kando under the old regime. The man who, according to the files Carver had provided, had allegedly siphoned off $200 million in aid money before fleeing the country when Okoro's rebels stormed the capital. The files said he was living in Potomac, Maryland. A man who once controlled a nation's treasury was now living in a quiet suburb known for its horse farms and its housewives who had too much plastic surgery. Brill didn't look up the address. He looked up the man. He spent 2 hours digging into Ngoma's new life. He found property records, tax filings, photos from a local charity gala. Ngoma had a wife, 2 kids in private school, and a golf membership at Congressional Country Club. He had rebranded himself as a political refugee, a victim of a brutal dictatorship, and the D.C. elite had bought it. He was a ghost of a different kind, a man trying to outrun his past by hiding it under a mountain of new money. Brill found the address and drove north into Maryland. The houses in Potomac were not houses. They were estates, set back from the road behind long, winding driveways and acres of perfectly manicured lawn. Ngoma's place was a red brick Georgian monstrosity with white columns and a fleet of expensive German cars parked in the circular driveway. Brill didn't drive up to the gate. He parked a half-mile down the road and walked, melting into the shadows of the old-growth oak trees that lined the street. He watched the house for an hour. There was security, but it was lazy. A private patrol car drove past once. The front gate was closed, but a man in a polo shirt came out of a small guardhouse to accept a package from a FedEx truck. The man didn't look like a professional bodyguard. He looked like a retired cop, making some extra money to pay for his boat. Brill circled the property. The back of the estate bordered a thick patch of woods. The wrought iron fence was 8 feet tall, but there were no cameras on the back perimeter, no motion sensors. An oversight. The kind of mistake a man makes when he starts to believe his own lies, when he forgets that the ghosts of the people he robbed are still out there. He waited until after midnight. The lights in the house went out one by one, until only a single light remained on downstairs. A study, maybe. Brill went over the fence. He landed on the soft grass of the lawn without a sound. He moved through the darkness of the backyard, past a swimming pool that glowed with an eerie blue light and a tennis court that would never be used. He reached the back of the house. A set of French doors led from a stone patio into what looked like a library. The light was on in the room beyond. The lock on the French doors was the kind you buy at Home Depot. It was meant to keep out teenagers, not ghosts. Brill had it open in 10 seconds with a thin metal shim. He slipped inside. The room smelled of old leather and expensive scotch. Jean-Pierre Ngoma was sitting in a wingback chair, a book open in his lap, a glass of amber liquid on the table beside him. He was wearing a silk smoking jacket. He looked like a man playing a part in a movie about his own life. He didn't hear Brill enter. Brill closed the doors behind him. The soft click of the latch was the only sound. Ngoma looked up, his eyes widening slightly. He wasn't scared yet. He was annoyed. He thought Brill was one of his staff. "What is it?" he asked, his English accented with the French of the colonial elite. "I told you I was not to be disturbed." "We need to talk," Brill said. He didn't move from the shadows by the door. Ngoma's annoyance turned to confusion, then to a dawning cold fear. He was looking at a man he had never seen before, a man who had appeared out of thin air in his locked study. He reached for the phone on the table. "I wouldn't do that," Brill said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room. Ngoma's hand froze. He stared at Brill, his mind racing, trying to place him. A thief. An assassin. "Who are you?" Ngoma whispered. "What do you want?" "I want to talk about Imara Okoro," Brill said. Ngoma's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know anyone by that name." "She's the daughter of the man who is living in your old house," Brill said. "The man you've been telling everyone in this town is a monster. She was taken yesterday." "This has nothing to do with me," Ngoma said, his voice rising, getting shrill. "I am a refugee. I am a victim of that butcher. I have nothing to do with this kidnapping." "That's not what I asked," Brill said. He took a step out of the shadows. "I didn't ask if you had anything to do with it. I asked you to talk about it. Tell me who did." "How would I know?" Ngoma blustered, trying to regain some of his composure. "The man has 1,000 enemies. I am just one of them." "You're the one who lives an hour's drive away," Brill said. "And you're the one who moved $3 million out of a bank in the Cayman Islands 2 weeks ago. You moved it to an unflagged account in Cyprus. That's a lot of money to move for a refugee, Jean-Pierre. It's the kind of money you'd need to hire a team of professionals." Ngoma looked like he'd been slapped. The blood drained from his face. "My finances are my own business. You have no right." "I have the account number," Brill said, cutting him off. "I have the transaction records. I have the name of the shell corporation you used to hide it. And I have the address of your son's boarding school in Switzerland. He likes to ski, doesn't he?" Ngoma stared at him, his mouth opening and closing silently. The mask of the civilized exile was gone. Underneath was the terrified face of a thief who had just been caught. "It wasn't me," he finally whispered, his voice cracking. "I swear on my children's lives, it wasn't me. An operation like this, it's too loud. Too messy. It draws attention. That is the last thing I want." "Then who?" Brill asked. "Your old friends from the government? The ones who escaped with you?" "They are old men," Ngoma said. "They sit in cafes in Paris and talk about the good old days. They have no stomach for this kind of fight anymore." He leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "But there were others. The ones we hired. The professionals." "Executive options," Brill said, his voice flat. Ngoma nodded eagerly. "Yes. Them. Their leader, the South African. Simon. He was a devil." He enjoyed the work. He was angry when we lost. He said we didn't let him fight his way. After the fall, he disappeared. But men like that, they don't just retire. They find new wars. He looked at Brill, a flicker of hope in his eyes. It was him. It has to be him. He has the skills. He has the men. And he hates Okoro as much as I do. Brill stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch. He had what he came for. A name. A confirmation. A direction. He turned and walked back toward the French doors. "Wait," Ngoma cried out. "What are you going to do?" "You're not going to. You believe me, don't you?" Brill paused at the door, his hand on the handle. He looked back at the terrified man in the silk smoking jacket. "I believe you're scared," Brill said. "And I believe you'll stay that way." He slipped out the door, closing it softly behind him, and vanished into the darkness of the manicured lawn. Chapter 7. The motel room in Springfield was an island of anonymity. Brill pulled the blackout curtains, plunging the room into a perpetual twilight. He didn't need the sun. He sat at the cheap particle board desk, the glow of the laptop screen painting his face in cool blue light. The world outside, with its traffic and its sunlight and its ordinary people, ceased to exist. His world was now the global network of whispers, lies, and digital ghosts. He'd dealt with the first name on Okoro's list, the exiled finance minister. Ngoma was a dead end, a scared man hiding behind his money. Now for the second, the Sons of the Sahel. Brill didn't use a standard browser. He used a custom shell that routed his connection through a series of encrypted nodes, bouncing the signal from a server in Estonia to one in Brazil to another in Singapore before it ever reached its destination. To any network sniffer, he didn't exist. The Sons of the Sahel were a known quantity, at least on the surface. The CIA profile Carver had provided called them an Islamist militant group operating on Kando's northern border, a mix of religious zealots and opportunistic bandits who used ideology as an excuse for smuggling and extortion. Their public face was a slick website full of grainy videos of masked men with AK-47s, denouncing Okoro as a Western puppet and calling for a pure Islamic state. It was standard-issue propaganda. Brill ignored the public face. He was looking for the back door. He started on the dark web, navigating to encrypted forums where men like the Sons of the Sahel came to do business. The air in these digital back alleys was thick with paranoia. Users communicated in code, their identities hidden behind layers of cryptographic keys. Brill didn't try to join the conversation. He just listened. He searched for chatter related to the kidnapping. He found it, but it was all wrong. It was boastful, third-hand bragging. Users claiming their brothers in America had struck a great blow against the tyrant Okoro. But the language was vague, full of religious platitudes and short on tactical detail. It was the talk of fanboys, not operators. The men who had taken Amara Okoro from the DuPont Hotel were quiet professionals. They didn't brag on the internet. He dismissed them as the primary actors in the kidnapping. They lacked the sophistication. But that didn't mean they weren't connected. A professional team costs money. And groups like the Sons of the Sahel were always raising money. Brill shifted his focus from chatter to finance. He began to scrape the forums for transaction IDs, for the telltale strings of alphanumeric code that marked a cryptocurrency transfer. He found hundreds of them, small donations trickling in from all over the world. He used a piece of software Carver had provided to begin mapping the flow of the money. For hours, he watched the digital river. It was a mess of tangled tributaries, designed to be untraceable. But Brill wasn't trying to trace every drop. He was looking for a confluence, a point where the small streams flowed together into a larger current. He found it at 3:17 in the morning. A pattern. Dozens of small Bitcoin and Monero wallets, all being emptied on a regular basis into a single, larger wallet. This was the collection point. The group's treasury. From here, the money would be laundered, converted into cash or weapons or supplies. This was the nerve center. He copied the wallet's address. It was a long, complex string of characters. To the rest of the world, it was an anonymous account. But Carver's firm didn't operate in the rest of the world. They had back doors. Brill opened a secure communication channel on the laptop, a direct, encrypted line to a server farm in a bunker somewhere under the Virginia countryside. He uploaded the wallet address. He didn't type a request. He just sent the data. He knew a man on the other end, a data analyst who owed Carver a favor, would know what to do. He waited. He didn't pace. He didn't drink coffee. He just sat in the blue glow of the screen, perfectly still, conserving his energy. An hour passed. A new file appeared on his desktop. It was a single document, heavily encrypted. Brill unlocked it. The file showed the transaction history of the dark web wallet. It had been systematically emptied once a week for the last 6 months. The cryptocurrency was moved to a large international exchange, converted into US dollars, and then wired to a legitimate bank account. A checking account at a PNC Bank branch in Georgetown. The file contained the name on the account. Dr. Adebayo Bello. Brill did a new search, this time on the open internet. Dr. Bello was not a ghost. He was a very public figure. A tenured professor of post-colonial African studies at George Washington University. He was a frequent guest on cable news, a respected academic who wrote scathing articles criticizing the Okoro regime for its human rights abuses and its corruption. He was also the chairman of the Kandan People's Relief Fund, a registered charity that claimed to provide food and medical supplies to refugees displaced by the conflict on the northern border. Brill pulled up a photo of the professor. He was a man in his late 50s with a neat gray beard, warm, intelligent eyes, and a wardrobe of tweed jackets with leather elbow patches. He looked like he spent his weekends at wine tastings and poetry readings. He also looked like the man who was laundering money for a terrorist organization. Brill closed the laptop. The digital hunt was over. The physical one was about to begin. The professor was the next rock he needed to kick over. People like Dr. Bello didn't usually have the stomach for violence themselves, but they knew the people who did. He was a link in the chain. He stood up and stretched, the muscles in his back popping. He walked over to the bed where the Glock 19 lay, clean and ready. He picked it up, the cold, hard weight of it familiar and comforting in his hand. He worked the slide, chambering around with a soft metallic snick. He holstered the weapon at the small of his back, where his jacket would cover it. He grabbed the keys to the Explorer and walked to the door. He didn't look back at the messy room, at the empty water bottles, at the digital ghosts he had chased all night. They didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the next target. He stepped out of the motel room into the gray pre-dawn light. The air was cool and damp. He got into the Explorer, the engine turning over with a quiet, reliable rumble. He pulled out of the parking lot and turned the truck north, back toward the city, back toward the world of respectable men in tweed jackets. Back toward the hunt. Chapter 8. The building was a monument to modern capitalism, a sheer cliff of dark glass and steel on Pennsylvania Avenue that scraped the sky and reflected the distant, impotent lights of the city. The sign out front, carved into a slab of black granite, was discreet, Aegis Strategic Solutions. It sounded like a company that sold management software or consulting services. It was a company that sold wars. Aegis was the third name on Okoro's list, a major player in the world of private military contracting. They had their fingers in every profitable conflict, from the Horn of Africa to the South China Sea. They didn't call themselves mercenaries. They called themselves risk mitigation specialists. They had a board of directors, a quarterly report, and a team of lawyers who were better armed than most third-world armies. Brill sat in the Explorer, in a public parking garage across the street, watching the Aegis building. He wasn't looking at the building itself. He was watching the patterns. The security guard, who came out every hour on the hour for a cigarette. The cleaning crew that arrived at 10 p.m. in a battered blue van. The late working executive, who left at 11:17 p.m., talking loudly into his phone about leveraged buyouts. He watched for 3 hours, until the building settled into its deep night rhythm. The lights were out, except for the emergency lighting in the hallways and the soft glow of the lobby. It was time. He didn't try to go in the front door. He walked around to the rear of the building, to the service alley where the dumpsters sat like sleeping iron beasts. A single camera watched the alley. Brill stood in the shadows just outside its field of view and took out a small, powerful infrared emitter. He aimed it at the camera's lens. To the guard watching the monitor in the basement security office, the screen showing the alley would just be a fizz of white static, a momentary glitch he'd blame on cheap equipment. The service door was steel, with a magnetic lock connected to a keycard reader. High-tech. Expensive. Brill took a device from his bag, no bigger than a deck of cards. He placed it over the reader. The device ran through a series of rolling codes, mimicking the signals of a high-level access card. It took 45 seconds. The light on the reader flashed from red to green, with a soft, permissive click. Brill opened the door and slipped inside, retrieving his IR emitter as he went. The camera feed behind him returned to normal. He was in a concrete hallway that smelled of disinfectant and trash. He moved down the hall to the service elevator, bypassing the keypad with a simple magnetic pick. He rode the elevator not to the executive suites, but to the floor below them. The 27th floor. The home of the IT department. The elevator doors opened onto a hallway that was dark and silent. A motion sensor was mounted on the ceiling. Brill took a can of compressed air from his bag and sprayed it with a chemical coolant. The lens of the sensor frosted over instantly, blinding it. He walked past it without a sound. The door to the Aegis server room was more impressive than the front door of the building. It was a thick slab of steel with a biometric fingerprint scanner and a retinal scanner. It was designed to stop spies and corporate raiders. Brill ignored it. He went to the wall next to the door. He took out a small acoustic sensor and placed it against the drywall, listening. He was listening for the telltale hum of the server room's dedicated HVAC system. He found it. He marked a spot on the wall. From his bag, he took a small diamond-tipped drill. It was almost silent. He drilled a series of small, connected holes in the drywall, creating a neat 6-inch square. He lifted the piece of drywall out and set it on the floor. Behind it was a layer of sound-dampening insulation. He pulled it out carefully. And behind that was the prize, the cold air return duct for the server room. The grate was held in place by 4 simple screws. He had them out in a minute. The duct was just wide enough for him to squeeze through. He pulled himself up and into the darkness, replacing the grate behind him. He crawled through the cold, dark space, the roar of the server fans growing louder. He came to another grate. This one opened into the server room itself. He peered through the slats. The room was a technological cathedral, bathed in the cold blue and green lights of dozens of server racks. It was kept at a steady 60 degrees, the air humming with the sound of fans and the silent, ceaseless flow of data. This was the company's brain, and he was inside its skull. He dropped silently to the raised floor. He didn't go to the main administrator's terminal. That would be too obvious, too easily tracked. He went to a secondary diagnostic console in the corner, a terminal used by technicians that had high-level access but low-level monitoring. He sat down and went to work. He didn't hack the system with a brute force attack. He used a social engineering approach. He knew the name of Aegis's head of IT from his research. He crafted a password reset request that looked like it came from the man's home computer, spoofing his IP address. The system, seeing a request from a trusted source, complied. He was in. He didn't search for kidnapping or a Koro. He searched for project codenames associated with Kando. He found a dozen of them. Project Zebra. Project Savannah. Most were legitimate security contracts, logistics reports. He dug deeper into the archives, into the proposals folder. And then he found it. The project was codenamed Colton Claw. He opened the file. It wasn't a memo. It was a complete operational playbook. A multi-phase plan to destabilize the Kando government. Phase 1 was a media campaign, planting stories about Okoro's corruption in European newspapers. Phase 2 was a series of low-level cyber attacks on Kando's financial infrastructure. And Phase 3 was the kidnapping. It was all there. The target was identified as Asset A, Amara Okoro. The plan detailed her movements in D.C., the layout of the DuPont Hotel, the use of a protest as a diversion, the smoke canisters, the non-lethal takedown of her security. It was the exact blueprint for what had happened. The objective was spelled out in cold, corporate language. The removal of Asset A from paternal control will create a leverage point. The asset's safe return will be contingent upon the Kando government granting Aegis Strategic Solutions exclusive 50-year mineral rights to the Colton-rich eastern provinces. Brill felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was it. He scrolled to the last page of the proposal. It was a sign-off sheet. A dozen names from Aegis's board of directors had approved the plan. And at the bottom, in big red digital letters, was a single word stamped across the page. Shelved. Underneath it, a date from 2 months ago and a note, project postponed. Risk assessment pending. Political climate unfavorable. Brill stared at the word. Shelved. Not cancelled. Postponed. Had they put it back in motion? Or had someone else gotten their hands on this playbook? A rival company? A foreign intelligence service? Or Simon, the mercenary who hated Okoro as much as Aegis coveted his country's resources? The blueprint was real, but the architect was still a ghost. He copied the entire file onto an encrypted flash drive. The progress bar on the screen seemed to move in slow motion. The hum of the servers suddenly felt oppressively loud. He was halfway through the download when he heard it. A sound from outside the server room door. A key card sliding into a lock. Brill's head snapped up. His hand went to the Glock at the small of his back. The light on the door flashed green. The heavy steel door began to swing open. Chapter 9. The heavy steel door swung inward. Brill didn't move. He was a statue in the corner of the server room, a shadow among shadows. The man who stepped inside wasn't a security guard. He was young, maybe 25, with a thin ponytail and a t-shirt that said syntax error. He was carrying a can of Jolt Cola and humming tunelessly to whatever was playing in his earbuds. A night shift IT tech, coming in to check on a server that was running hot. The tech walked past the diagnostic console where Brill had been sitting, his eyes on a blinking red light on a rack across the room. He hadn't seen Brill. He hadn't seen the flash drive still plugged into the console, its tiny light blinking as it finished copying the Colton Claw file. Brill moved. He was a blur of silent motion. He crossed the room in 3 strides. The tech must have felt the air move, because he started to turn, his eyes wide with surprise. He opened his mouth to shout. The shout never came. Brill's hand clamped over his mouth, his other arm snaking around the tech's chest, lifting him off his feet. The can of Jolt clattered to the floor. Brill wasn't trying to kill him. He was just putting him to sleep. He applied precise pressure to the carotid artery in the tech's neck. For a few seconds the kid struggled, a frantic panic dance. Then his body went limp, a dead weight in Brill's arms. Brill lowered him gently to the floor behind a server rack, out of sight of the door's internal camera. He pulled the earbuds out. Generic synth pop leaked into the quiet room. Brill turned it off. He walked back to the console. The download was complete. He pulled the flash drive, slipped it into his pocket, and logged out of the system, erasing the temporary password he'd created. He wiped the console's keyboard with a cloth from his kit, removing any trace of his presence. He was a ghost again. He didn't leave through the door. He went back to the air duct, squeezed through the narrow opening, replaced the grate, the insulation, and the square of drywall. He used a small tube of spackle from his kit to cover the seams, smudging it with dust from the floor. It wouldn't hold up to a close inspection, but it would pass a casual glance. He went out the way he came in, a silent wraith moving through the sleeping corporate giant. 30 minutes after he'd entered, he was back in the Explorer, pulling out of the parking garage and into the pre-dawn emptiness of the D.C. streets. He didn't go back to the motel. He drove to a 24-hour diner in Alexandria, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like regret. He sat in a corner booth, ordered a black coffee he didn't drink, and plugged the encrypted flash drive into his laptop. He read the Colton Claw file again. It was a perfect match. The smoke, the diversion, the non-lethal takedown. It was the work of a team of corporate strategists who thought war was something you planned on a whiteboard. But the big red shelf stamp was a problem. It meant Aegis had the motive and the plan, but maybe not the nerve. Or maybe they'd subcontracted it. Outsourced the risk. To someone like Simon. Or maybe the plan had been stolen. Leaked. Sold to the highest bidder. The blueprint was too good, too detailed. It made the kidnapping look less like a passionate act of political revenge and more like a business transaction. He closed the file. The corporate angle was a strong possibility, but it wasn't a certainty. He still had to run the other traps. He went back to his own research from the night before. To the man who looked like a poet, but moved money for terrorists. Professor Adebayo Bello. George Washington University's Gelman Library was an imposing block of brutalist concrete, a place that valued books more than sunlight. Brill walked in with a half-dozen students who were either starting their day early or finishing it late. He didn't look out of place. He wore a gray hoodie and carried a messenger bag. He could have been a grad student, a visiting scholar, anyone. He found Professor Bello in the stacks on the 6th floor, in the African Studies section. The professor was standing in a narrow aisle, running his finger along the spines of a row of books. He was dressed just like his faculty photo, a tweed jacket with worn leather patches on the elbows, a pair of rumpled corduroys, and comfortable-looking loafers. He looked thoughtful, academic. He looked harmless. Brill walked up the aisle. Professor Bello. Bello looked up, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. He offered a mild, inquiring smile. Yes. Can I help you? I was hoping you could, Brill said. He stopped a few feet away, blocking the narrow aisle. I'm interested in the Camden People's Relief Fund. The professor's smile became a little warmer, a little more practiced. Ah, yes. A worthy cause. We do our best to help the victims of Okoro's brutal regime. Are you interested in making a donation? I'm interested in where the donations go, Brill said. The smile faltered. A flicker of caution appeared in the professor's intelligent eyes. It's all quite transparent. The funds are used to purchase medical supplies, food, blankets. We have partners on the ground who handle the distribution. Partners like the Sons of the Sahel. Brill asked. His voice was quiet, conversational. The name hit Bello like a physical blow. The color drained from his face. The friendly academic vanished, replaced by a man looking at a snake that had just appeared in his path. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered. I think you do, Brill said. He took a step closer. The aisle was very narrow. I think you know that the money you collect at your Georgetown fundraisers doesn't buy a lot of blankets. I think it buys bullets. I think it buys RPGs. And I think some of it was used to hire the men who took Amara Okoro. That's an outrageous accusation. Bello hissed, his voice a panicked whisper. He glanced around, but the aisle was empty. They were alone, surrounded by the silent, leather-bound history of the continent he claimed to be saving. Who are you? Are you from the FBI? Do I look like I'm from the FBI? Brill asked. He took another step. He was in the professor's personal space now. The FBI would arrest you. They would freeze your accounts. They would read you your rights. I'm not going to do any of those things. The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't us, Bello said, his voice cracking. He was sweating now, a sheen of moisture on his forehead. I swear to you. The Sons, they are fighters, not spies. They can stage an ambush on a desert road. They cannot execute a complex operation in the heart of Washington, D.C. They lack the training, the resources, the sophistication. But they have the motive, Brill pressed. And they have your money. I am just a fundraiser. Bello insisted, his back now pressed against a shelf of books. I believe in the cause. I believe Okoro must be stopped. I raise money to help the cause. Where it goes after that, how they use it, that is the cost of revolution. Tell me who has the sophistication, Brill said, his voice like a chip of ice. You're a respected man, Professor. You move in circles of exiles and dissidents. You hear things. Who has the money and the men to do this? I don't know, Bello pleaded. Brill reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out his phone. He swiped the screen and held it up for the professor to see. It was a photograph. A recent one. A woman and two young children, smiling, standing in front of a small house with a tin roof. Your sister's house, Brill said softly. In Freetown. It's a nice place. It would be a shame if something happened to it. A fire, perhaps. They happen all the time in Freetown. Bello stared at the picture, his face collapsing. The last of his academic arrogance crumbled into pure primal terror. This man wasn't FBI. He wasn't a cop. He was something else entirely. Please, Bello whispered, tears welling in his eyes. They are all I have left. Then talk, Brill said. I don't know for sure, Bello said, his voice trembling. But there is talk. Not from the Sons. From others. They say the kidnapping was not about politics. Not about revolution. It was about business. About hate. What hate? The Americans, Bello whispered, as if afraid to say the word aloud. The ones who hate Okoro, not because he is a dictator, but because he is an African. The ones who say his trade deals are stealing their jobs. The ones who march with angry flags. He looked at Brill, his eyes wide with fear. They call themselves patriots. They are a snake Okoro did not see in his own garden. I heard they were looking to hire professionals. Men who knew how to do this kind of work. Brill absorbed the information. It fit. The professionalism of the kidnapping, married to a raw domestic motive. It was the missing piece. He lowered the phone and put it back in his pocket. He took a step back, giving the professor room to breathe. Bello slid down the bookshelf, slumping to the floor, a broken man in a tweed jacket. Brill turned and walked away without another word. He left the professor sobbing quietly in the stacks, surrounded by the books that told the stories of his continent's tragedies. He had just become a part of one. Brill walked down the aisle, his footsteps silent on the linoleum floor, his mind already on the next move, on the next name, on the new and unexpected trail of the men who called themselves patriots. Chapter 10. Brill went back to the DuPont Circle Hotel. He didn't go in the front door, where a rookie DC cop stood looking bored and important. He walked around to the service alley in the back. The yellow crime scene tape was still up, a flimsy plastic suggestion of authority. The alley smelled of stale garbage and rain. Brill slipped under the tape and went in the same steel service door the kidnappers had used for their exit. The lock had been dusted for prints, the frame scarred by the crime scene unit's tools, but it was unsecured. A cop had been posted there, but he was gone, probably getting coffee. It was the kind of lazy detail that happened 12 hours into a static investigation. Brill moved through the hotel's service corridors, a ghost retracing another ghost's steps. He came out into the main lobby. It was a different place now. The energy of the initial chaos was gone, replaced by the stale, grinding boredom of a stalled investigation. The air smelled of cold coffee and frustration. A few FBI agents in dark suits stood around talking into their phones, looking important. A couple of DC cops were by the door, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. The lounge, the Pembroke, was where the action was. Or the lack of it. It was roped off, a crime scene within a crime scene. And in the middle of it, standing over a small evidence marker on the thick rug, were the two men in charge of the mess. Special Agent in Charge Davenport of the FBI was holding a Starbucks cup like it was a prop. He looked fresh, his suit unwrinkled, his tie perfectly knotted. He looked like he'd gotten a full 8 hours of sleep and had his assistant lay out his clothes. D.C. Metro Detective K. Ron Washington looked like he'd been sleeping in his car if he'd slept at all. His tweed jacket was rumpled, there was a fresh coffee stain on his shirt, and the unlit cigar was back in the corner of his mouth, looking frayed and defeated. Brill stood just outside the ropes, near a potted palm, looking like a low-level federal agent waiting for instructions. He blended in. He became part of the furniture. "I'm telling you, it's a partial," Washington was saying, his voice a low, gravelly rumble of pure frustration. He pointed at the evidence marker with the wet end of his cigar. A heel print. Not enough for a match, not from any database you've got. But the tread pattern is distinctive. It's from a boot, not a shoe. An import. Maybe Israeli, maybe South African. "It's evidence in a federal investigation, Detective," Davenport said, his voice smooth and patient, the way you talk to a child or a slow-witted dog. "It needs to be photographed, cast, and sent to the lab at Quantico for full forensic analysis." Quantico. Washington let out a short, barking laugh that had no humor in it. "By the time your lab boys get done with it, the girl will be a memory, and the kidnappers will be sipping cocktails in a country without an extradition treaty. I've got a guy down on 4th Street. An old cobbler from Ethiopia. The man knows the sole of every shoe made since the Roman Empire. I could take him a picture, and he could tell me more in 5 minutes than your lab will tell you in 5 days." "A cobbler," Davenport said, a faint pitying smile on his face. "That's your expert witness?" "A cobbler." "My expert witness is a guy who gets results," Washington shot back, his temper starting to fray. "While you're filling out your requisition forms in triplicate, I could be hitting every surplus store and specialty boot shop in the tri-state area. It's called police work, Davenport. Maybe you've read about it in a manual somewhere." "What I've read," Davenport said, taking a delicate sip of his coffee, "is the Hostage Act of 18 U.S.C. 1203, which gives the Bureau primary jurisdiction here. The evidence will be handled according to federal protocol. We're building a profile, Detective. We're looking at the big picture. The international players. The political motives." "You're looking at the big picture?" Washington said, stepping closer. "Let me tell you what the big picture is. The big picture is we're standing in my city, where my people get shot, my stores get robbed, and my little girls go missing. This isn't some political game to me. This is just another Tuesday. The girl was taken from here." He stomped his foot on the expensive rug. "The guys who took her drove on my streets. They're probably holed up in some row house in my district. This isn't an international incident. It's a kidnapping. And I know how to work a kidnapping." Washington was angry now. He pulled a small, spiral-bound notepad from the inside pocket of his jacket and flipped it open. "I've been talking to the hotel staff. The kitchen workers. The valets. The people your agents in their shiny shoes wouldn't even look at. A dishwasher in the back, saw a blue van in the alley. An hour before the snatch. A new van, a Ford Transit, but it had a dent on the rear passenger side door. A fresh one. Did your high-tech traffic cam analysis pick that up? Davenport's smile tightened. We are pursuing all credible leads, Detective. Yeah, well, while you're pursuing, I'm hunting, Washington grumbled. He scribbled a note on his pad, then shoved it back into his pocket. He walked over to a table, where a uniformed officer had left a tray with 2 coffees and a bottle of water. He'd been so busy arguing, he hadn't gotten his own. Brill saw his moment. Washington was at the coffee table, his back to the room. Davenport was talking into his wrist mic, his attention diverted. Brill moved. He walked toward the coffee table, pulling out his phone like he was checking a message. He bumped the table, not hard, but just enough to make it wobble. Watch it, Washington grunted without turning around. Sorry, Brill said, his voice flat and forgettable. As Washington reached for a coffee, Brill's hand moved, a flicker of motion too quick to follow. His fingers dipped into the side pocket of Washington's rumpled tweed jacket, the one where he'd just shoved his notepad. The pad was thick, worn. Brill's fingers closed around it, lifting it with the delicate touch of a pickpocket. He had it in his own hand, shielded by his phone, in less than a second. He didn't stop. He just kept walking, heading for the lobby, another anonymous agent in a sea of them. Look, Davenport, Washington said, turning back around, coffee in hand. All I'm saying is, we can work together, or we can work against each other. But my way gets this girl found. Your way gets her on the side of a milk carton. He reached into his pocket for his notepad, to emphasize a point. His hand came out empty. He frowned. He patted his other pockets. A look of confusion, then dawning frustration, crossed his face. Brill didn't look back. He walked through the lobby, past the bored cops and the self-important feds. He pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped out into the cool morning air. He had the FBI's theories, and he had the DC Metro's leads. He had their friction, their arrogance, their flawed assumptions. He had it all, tucked away in a cheap spiral-bound notepad. He walked down the street, melting into the morning crowd, the notebook a heavy, satisfying weight in his hand. Chapter 11. Executive Options was dead. In its place was EO. Global, a name that sounded respectable, corporate, and vaguely threatening. Their offices were in a low black glass building in Tyson's Corner, the kind of place that housed defense contractors and data farms. There was no sign out front, just a discreet brushed steel plaque next to the door with the company's initials. It was a place that didn't want to be found, unless you already knew where to look. Brill knew. The address had been on Okoro's list, a piece of information that felt both like a clue and a trap. He didn't try to break in. He walked in the front door at 10 o'clock in the morning. The lobby was a cold, minimalist space of gray slate and chrome. A single receptionist, a woman with blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun and an earpiece tucked behind her ear, sat behind a desk that looked like a modern art sculpture. She looked up as Brill entered, her eyes cool and professional. She had the stillness of someone who was more than just a receptionist. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was flat, without inflection. "I'm here to see Simon," Brill said. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Brill said. "Tell him it's about the Red River." The woman's expression didn't change, but her eyes flickered for a fraction of a second. The Red River wasn't a place on a map. It was a memory. A bloody one. She pressed a button on the console in front of her. "There's a gentleman here to see you, sir," she said, her voice still perfectly calm. "He says it's regarding the Red River." There was a pause. Brill could hear the faint, tinny sound of a voice from her earpiece. "Yes, sir," she said. "I understand." She looked back at Brill. "He'll see you. 3rd floor. The elevator will take you up." As if on cue, a silent elevator door slid open behind him. Brill walked to the elevator. He felt the woman's eyes on his back the entire way. He stepped inside. There were no buttons. The door closed, and the car began to ascend. The third floor was as quiet and sterile as the lobby. A single hallway stretched out, lined with smoked glass office fronts. At the far end was a heavy oak door. Brill walked toward it. He knew there were cameras watching him. He knew there were probably men with guns behind the smoked glass. He didn't care. He reached the oak door and opened it without knocking. The office was large, with a commanding view of the Virginia hills. The walls were covered not with art, but with framed maps of conflict zones: Angola, Sierra Leone, the Donbass region of Ukraine. A large, modern desk sat in the center of the room. And behind it sat Simon. He hadn't changed much. He was older, his close-cropped hair now more salt than pepper. The lines around his eyes were deeper. But he was still lean and hard, with the coiled energy of a predator. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit, a stark contrast to the worn fatigues Brill remembered. He was holding a cup of tea, his little finger extended slightly. "Brill," Simon said. His voice was a low, cultured rumble, a South African accent smoothed by years of living abroad. "I have to admit, I'm surprised. After all these years. I heard you'd fallen off the face of the earth." "I did," Brill said. He closed the door behind him. "And now you're back," Simon said, taking a slow sip of his tea. "And you're dropping old call signs in my lobby. That's not like you." The Brill I knew was never sentimental. "I'm not here to reminisce," Brill said. He stood in the center of the room, a silent, imposing figure. "No, I don't suppose you are," Simon said. He put his teacup down with a soft click. "You're here about the girl. The warlord's daughter." It wasn't a question. "You've been keeping up," Brill said. "It's my business to keep up," Simon said. "A high-profile kidnapping in my own backyard. Of course, I'm following it. It's sloppy, messy, bad for business." He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers behind his head. "So the great Jomo Okoro, the butcher of Kivu, hires a ghost to find his little princess. And the ghost he hires happens to be one of my old boys. The irony is delicious." "Was it you, Simon?" Brill asked, his voice flat. Simon laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Me? Kidnap a child? Brill, you wound me. That's not my style. My style is a sniper round from 1,000 yards. My style is a car bomb. Clean. Efficient. I don't do kidnappings. Too many moving parts. Too many chances for things to go wrong." "You do what the client pays you to do," Brill countered. "And a man like Ngoma has the money. And the motive." Simon's smile faded. "Ah, so you've been talking to the old finance minister. I'm sure he was very helpful. The man would sell his own mother for a discount on his golf fees. Yes, he hates Okoro. So do I. The man is a thug who got lucky. But I wouldn't get into bed with Ngoma. He's a coward and a fool." "Someone did," Brill said. "Someone with your training. Your expertise." The snatch at the hotel was professional. "It had professional elements," Simon corrected him. "But it was clumsy. They left a federal agent alive. They let the father lock himself away. A true professional would have taken the father, not the daughter. He's the asset. She's just leverage." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "This has the feel of something else. Something amateur. Something passionate." Brill didn't react. He just stood there, absorbing the information, weighing it. Simon was a liar and a killer, but he was also a professional. And he understood the nuances of the game. "So you're not involved," Brill said. "I am not," Simon said. "And I'd advise you to walk away from this one. This isn't our world anymore, Brill. This isn't some brushfire war in Africa where the only rule is to get paid. This is Washington. There are layers here you don't understand. You're a blunt instrument in a city that requires a scalpel." "I was hired to do a job," Brill said. And you always were a good soldier, Simon said with a sigh. Always followed your orders. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the view. You know, I still think about that last job. The Red River. We almost had him. We almost turned the tide. But the politicians lost their nerve. They pulled our funding. He turned back to face Brill. You were the best I ever had, Brill. The best instincts. No fear. And no conscience. It was a beautiful thing to watch. A natural talent. He walked over to a small, discreet bar in the corner of the room and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass. A drink. For old time's sake. I'm not thirsty, Brill said. Simon shrugged and took a sip. Your loss. He swirled the liquid in his glass. Tell me, Brill. After all these years of being a ghost, of working for men like Carver, men who hide in their clean offices and send men like you to do their dirty work, do you ever miss it? The simplicity of it all. Us against them. The man with the steadiest hand wins. No politics. No lawyers. Just the job. No, Brill said. Simon smiled sadly. Liar. He finished his drink in one swallow and set the glass down with a sharp click. All right. You want my professional opinion? You're chasing the wrong ghost. You're looking for an international conspiracy, but this stinks of something local. Something domestic. Someone with a grudge that has nothing to do with Colton Mines and everything to do with flags and anthems. He walked back to his desk and sat down. The meeting was over. You should go now, Brill, Simon said, his voice turning cold again. Get out of my city. Because if you keep kicking over rocks, you're going to find something that even you can't handle. And if your path crosses with my business again, I won't be so nostalgic. Brill turned and walked to the door. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't look back. He opened the door and stepped out into the quiet hallway. As the door closed behind him, he heard Simon pick up his phone. Get me everything you can on the American Patriot Front, Simon said into the phone. I want to know who they are, who they talk to, and where they drink. Now. Brill stood motionless in the hallway for a moment, listening. Then he walked to the elevator, his face an unreadable mask. He had come here looking for a suspect. Instead, he'd found a competitor. Chapter 12. Brill drove south from Tyson's Corner, away from the black glass towers and the manicured corporate campuses. He left Simon and his expensive suit and his veiled threats behind him. The phone call he'd overheard was a problem. It meant Simon wasn't just a source of information anymore. He was a competitor. Another hunter was in the woods. And Simon wasn't the type to share his kill. The race was on. He ended up in a different motel. This one in Fredericksburg, an anonymous box off I-95 that catered to truckers and traveling salesmen. The room was identical to the last one. Cheap art bolted to the wall, a television that only got 3 channels, and the faint smell of mildew. He didn't care. He just needed a place to plug in his laptop. He sat in the dim light, the Explorer's engine still warm, and typed the name Simon had put in his head into the search bar, American Patriot Front. The internet showed him their public face first. A slick website with a logo of a coiled rattlesnake wrapped around a Minuteman rifle. It was full of articles with titles like The Globalist Threat to Our Borders and Reclaiming Our Heritage. It was all polished and professional, written by someone who knew how to use words like sovereignty and economic integrity as a cover for something much uglier. Brill ignored it. The public face was a lie. He went looking for the real one. He found it in the forums linked at the bottom of the page under a tab labeled Discussion. Here, in the digital darkness, the masks came off. The talk wasn't about economic integrity. It was about race. It wasn't about sovereignty. It was about hate. The language was a toxic stew of anti-immigrant, anti-globalist, and white supremacist poison, all wrapped in a flag of self-righteous patriotism. He scrolled through pages of posts. They were angry, paranoid, and full of misspelled words. They talked about the Great Replacement, about secret cabals in Washington selling out the country. And they talked about Jomo Okoro. The Kandin president was a popular subject. They called him a savage, a dictator. They posted pictures of him shaking hands with American politicians, with captions that dripped with contempt. The trade deal he was there to sign was a focal point of their rage. They saw it as a betrayal, a deal that would send American money and resources to Africa while mines closed in West Virginia and factories shut down in Ohio. Brill was looking for more than just rhetoric. He was looking for a signal in the noise. He was looking for a leader. He found him in a user named Minuteman76. Minuteman76 didn't post as often as the others, but when he did, they listened. His posts were different. They weren't just angry rants, they were calls to action. He wrote about the need for direct measures, for patriots to move beyond words. He was a charismatic, unhinged ideologue, the kind of man who could convince others that his hate was their own. Brill started to build a profile. He cross-referenced Minuteman76's posts, looking for patterns, for slips of the tongue. The man claimed to be a veteran. He talked about his time in the service, but the details were wrong. He mentioned units and places that didn't quite fit. He was lying. Or he was embellishing, building a persona. Brill focused on the metadata. He ran a trace on Minuteman76's IP address. It was hidden behind a series of proxies, just as he expected. But the man was sloppy. In a post from 3 months ago, complaining about a local zoning board, he had forgotten to activate his VPN. For 5 minutes, his real IP address had been exposed. It was a digital footprint. And it was all Brill needed. The IP address was registered to a small internet service provider in rural Culpeper County, Virginia. Brill cross-referenced the address with public records. The service was registered to a man named Dale Eberhardt. A search on Eberhardt's name brought up a sparse public record. A few traffic tickets, a lien on a small single-story house, and a business license for a failing print shop. Brill kept digging. He found a picture of Dale Eberhardt from a local newspaper article about small business loans. He was a man in his late 40s with thinning hair, a weak chin, and the resentful eyes of someone who felt the world owed him something it had never delivered. He was Minuteman76. Brill went back to the forums. He searched for any mention of real-world meetings. He found a post from Minuteman76, a coded announcement. The quarterly meeting of the book club will be held Friday night. Same time, same place. We'll be discussing Chapter 17, The Tree of Liberty. Friday night. That was tonight. But where was the same place? Brill went back to Dale Eberhardt's digital life. He found a social media profile, mostly dormant. But his friends weren't. Brill started going through their profiles. He found a picture of a group of men, Eberhardt among them, standing in front of a bar holding beers. The bar was called the Patriots Pub. A quick search showed it had closed down 2 years ago. But the building was still there. It was a VFW hall, post 3890, just off Route 29. He had it. He drove west, out of the suburban sprawl, and into the rolling hills of the Virginia Piedmont. The landscape changed. The strip malls and housing developments gave way to horse farms and old tobacco barns with peeling paint. This was a different America, a place that felt like it had been left behind. He found the VFW hall easily. It was a low cinder-block building set back from the road, with a gravel parking lot and a flagpole out front where a tattered American flag hung limply in the still evening air. The sign was faded, the paint chipped. It looked forgotten. But the parking lot was full. Not with cars, but with pickup trucks. Fords, Chevys, Rams. Most of them were American-made. Most of them had gun racks in the back windows and defiant bumper stickers on the tailgate. Brill parked the Explorer down the road, in the lot of a closed-down gas station and walked back. He didn't go near the hall. He found a spot in the woods across the street, a place where he could see without being seen. He took out his monocular and settled in to watch. Men were arriving in 2s and 3s. They were mostly white, mostly middle-aged. They wore work boots and flannel shirts and baseball caps. They looked like farmers, mechanics, construction workers. They looked like the kind of men who worked with their hands and felt like the country they'd been promised had been stolen from them. He watched them greet each other, handshakes that were a little too hard, pats on the back that were more like punches. They were a tribe. He saw Dale Eberhardt, Minuteman 76, arrive. He got out of a rusty Ford Ranger, and the other men gravitated toward him. He wasn't a big man, but he carried himself with a self-important swagger. He was their leader. Brill watched for an hour as the last of them trickled in. He counted 30 men. A small army. He lowered his monocular. He had the who, the what, and the where. Now he needed to get inside. He couldn't go in as himself. He needed a cover. He looked down at his own clothes, the anonymous gray hoodie and jeans. He looked at the men going into the hall. He got up and walked back to his truck. He opened the back and took out the bag Carver had provided. He rummaged through it. Under the Glock and the sat phone, he found what he was looking for. A set of dirty work coveralls, the kind a mechanic would wear. A worn baseball cap with the logo of a tractor company on it. He stripped off his own clothes and pulled on the coveralls. They were stiff, smelling faintly of oil. He put on the cap, pulling the brim low. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror. The face was the same, but the context was different. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a disgruntled trucker, a laid-off factory worker. He was one of them. He got out of the truck and started walking toward the VFW hall, his stride changing, becoming a little heavier, a little more world-weary. He walked across the gravel lot, past the pickup trucks and the bumper stickers, toward the single door where the light spilled out into the darkness. Chapter 13. The air inside the VFW hall was thick with the smell of cheap beer, stale cigarette smoke, and a simmering collective anger that was almost a physical presence. The room was long and low-ceilinged, with wood-paneled walls covered in faded photographs of men in uniform, most of them young, all of them dead. A makeshift bar had been set up at one end, a couple of kegs of Pabst Blue Ribbon sitting in plastic tubs of melting ice. At the other end, a portable lectern stood in front of a large American flag that had seen better days. Brill walked in, and nobody paid him any mind. He was just another face in the crowd, another guy in a work-worn baseball cap and greasy coveralls. A man with a belly that spilled over his belt buckle stood by the door, checking names off a list. "Don't think I know you," the man said, his eyes small and suspicious. "Friend of a friend," Brill said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur he'd practiced in the truck. "Met a guy named Tiny at a truck stop down in Roanoke. Said you boys were having a get-together. Said you were like-minded." The man grunted. "Tiny? Yeah, I know Tiny." He looked Brill up and down, taking in the coveralls, the tired set of his shoulders. He saw what he expected to see. "All right. Go on in. Grab a beer. The meeting's about to start." Brill nodded and moved into the room. He went to the bar and got a plastic cup of foam that was mostly head. He found a spot at the back, leaning against the wall, half hidden by a pinball machine that had tilted long ago and never been righted. From here, he could see the whole room. The 30 men were a tribe. They were bound by a shared sense of grievance, a feeling that the country they knew had been taken from them by people in cities they didn't understand, by politicians who didn't speak their language. They talked in low, angry tones, their conversations a mix of conspiracy theories about globalist bankers and complaints about the price of diesel. Then Dale Eberhardt, Minuteman 76, stepped up to the lectern. The room went quiet. Eberhardt wasn't physically imposing, but he had a preacher's cadence and a zealot's eyes. He gripped the sides of the lectern, his knuckles white. Brothers, he began, his voice ringing with manufactured passion. I look out at this room, and I see the real America. I see men who work with their hands, who sweat for a living, who ain't afraid of a little dirt under their fingernails. And I see men who are being forgotten, betrayed. A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. They sit up there in Washington, Eberhard continued, pointing a trembling finger toward a non-existent North, and they make deals. They make deals with foreign dictators, with savages, who crawl out of the jungle to sit in our fine hotels. He spat the word hotel like it was a curse. They make deals to send our money, our resources, our jobs over to some hellhole in Africa, all so they can get a pat on the head from their globalist masters. The anger in the room was building, a low hum you could feel in the floorboards. This week, that savage, Jomo Okoro, is in our capital. He's here to sign a deal that will shut down a mine in West Virginia, so he can sell us the very same minerals his people dig out of the ground with their bare hands. And the politicians are smiling. They're shaking his bloody hand. Eberhard leaned into the microphone. Well, I say enough. The time for talking is over. The time for voting is over. The tree of liberty, my friends, is thirsty, and it must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. The room erupted in cheers. Men were on their feet, their fists in the air, their faces red with cheap beer and righteous fury. Brill didn't cheer. He just watched. He wasn't interested in the sermon. He was interested in the disciples. He scanned the crowd, looking for the ones who weren't just cheering. He was looking for the ones who were watching, the ones who had a different kind of stillness. He found them near the bar. A group of 4 men, standing slightly apart from the others. They were younger, harder. They weren't drinking beer, they had bottles of water. They weren't wearing flannel, they wore dark, functional clothing. And while the rest of the room was looking at Eberhard, they were watching the crowd, their eyes constantly moving. They were the muscle. The operators. Brill's gaze drifted down to their boots. The floor of the VFW hall was covered in decades of grime, a black sticky film of spilled beer and dirt. But the boots on these 4 men had a different kind of dirt on them. It was a distinctive, reddish-brown clay, caked deep in the treads. It was still damp. It wasn't the soil of the surrounding farmland. Brill had seen that kind of clay before, in a state park not 40 miles from here, a place known for its hiking trails and its isolated, abandoned farmhouses. He had it. A location. A possible safe house. He kept watching the 4 men. Eberhard was finishing his speech, his voice hoarse, and we have sent a message. A message that will be heard from the halls of Congress to the palaces of Africa. We have shown them that the American patriot is not asleep. As the crowd roared its approval, Brill saw one of the 4 men, the one who seemed to be their leader, lean over and say something to another. Brill was too far away to hear the words, but he could read the man's lips. It was only 2 words. Check the package. The other man nodded, a short, sharp jerk of his head. He separated from the group and moved toward a side door that probably led to a back office or a storage room. Brill now had 2 pieces of a puzzle. A location and a package. Amara. She was here. Or she had been. He had what he needed. It was time to go. Getting out was easier than getting in. He set his half-full cup of beer on top of the pinball machine and drifted toward the main door, just another guy heading out for a smoke. No one noticed him. Their attention was still on their leader, who was now basking in the adoration of his followers. Brill stepped out into the cool Virginia night. The air felt clean after the stale anger of the hall. He walked across the gravel lot, the crunch of his boots loud in the sudden quiet. He didn't look back. He got into the Explorer and started the engine. He didn't turn on his headlights until he was a mile down the road. He drove with a calm, steady hand, his mind already working on the next phase. The reconnaissance. The infiltration. The hunt had led him to the den. Now, it was time to see the wolves. Chapter 14. Brill drove east on Route 29, leaving the VFW hall and its tribe of angry men behind him. The windows of the Explorer were down, and the cool night air did little to wash away the stale smell of beer and righteous hate that clung to the mechanic's coveralls. He drove for 10 miles, then pulled into the parking lot of a dark, deserted church. He got out and stripped off the coveralls, tossing them into a dumpster behind the church. Underneath, he wore the same anonymous dark clothing as before. The costume had served its purpose. He sat in the driver's seat in the darkness, the engine off, and let the pieces click into place. The picture was getting clearer now, but it was uglier than he'd imagined. He had 3 separate, seemingly unconnected threads. Thread 1, the Aegis Colton Claw proposal. A slick, corporate-approved playbook for a professional kidnapping, complete with threat assessments and logistical plans. A plan that was officially stamped shelved. Thread 2, the American Patriot Front. A gaggle of angry, disenfranchised men, led by a charismatic wannabe named Dale Eberhardt. They had the motive, a raw, sputtering rage against Jomo Okoro and the trade deal he represented. But they didn't have the skills. The men Brill had seen in that hall couldn't have pulled off the smooth, silent snatch at the DuPont Hotel. They would have come in loud and stupid, all shotguns and shouting. Thread 3, the 4 quiet men at the back of the VFW hall. The ones with the professional stillness, the clean boots caked in a specific red clay, and the casual way they talked about the package. They were the muscle. They were the pros. The threads didn't run parallel. They were woven together. The Patriot Front had the motive. Aegis had the plan. And someone had provided the professionals to execute it. There was only one man who lived at the intersection of all 3. The man who had once run mercenaries for corporate interests in Africa. The man who knew the Aegis playbook because he'd probably helped write it. The man whose men were disciplined enough to pull off the snatch, but who was pragmatic enough to take a contract from a group of local fanatics if the price was right. Simon. Brill started the truck. He didn't drive south, back to his motel. He turned the Explorer around and drove north, back toward Tyson's Corner, back toward the black glass tower that housed EO Global. The conversation wasn't over. He didn't go to the office this time. He went to the parking garage beneath it. It was a vast, subterranean concrete cavern, mostly empty at this hour. He found Simon's car easily. It was a black Audi A8, parked in a reserved spot near the private elevator, the one marked with Simon's initials. Brill parked the Explorer 3 rows away, in the shadows. He got out and walked over to the Audi. He didn't try to break in. He just looked at it. Then he walked to the stairwell door, propped it open a crack with a folded piece of cardboard, and went inside. He sat on the cool concrete steps in the dark and waited. He waited for 2 hours. At 2:47 a.m., the private elevator dinged softly. The doors slid open, and Simon walked out. He was alone. He had taken off his suit jacket and loosened his tie. He looked tired, but he moved with the same coiled, predatory grace. He was talking on his phone, his voice a low, angry murmur. "No, I don't care what their timeline is," Simon was saying. "Eberhardt is an amateur playing a professional's game. He's a liability. I want our team out." The contract was for acquisition and delivery to the primary holding site. "That's it. We're done. Clean the files. All of them." He clicked the phone off and slid it into his pocket. He walked toward his car, pulling his keys from his pocket. He was distracted, his mind still on the phone call. He didn't see Brill until he was standing right behind him. Brill didn't say a word. He just stood there, a shadow that had detached itself from the other shadows in the garage. Simon froze, his hand halfway to the car door. He didn't startle. He didn't jump. He just went very, very still. He turned his head slowly. "Brill," he said, his voice a soft, dangerous sigh. "You're becoming a nuisance." "You lied to me," Brill said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. I omitted, Simon corrected him. There's a difference. It's called business. You should try it sometime. He leaned against his car, crossing his arms. He looked relaxed, but Brill could see the tension in his shoulders. So, you figured it out. I'm impressed. The old dog still has some teeth. The Patriot Front, Brill said. They were your clients. They were a funding source, Simon said with a dismissive wave of his hand. A group of useful idiots with a fat bank account and a grudge. They wanted to make a political statement. They had a plan, a surprisingly detailed one, I might add. Almost as if it had been written by corporate risk analysts. He gave Brill a thin, knowing smile. But they lacked the finesse to pull it off. They needed a consultant. So I provided one. A 4-man fire team to ensure the acquisition was handled professionally. A simple contract. You use my old team, Brill said. I saw them. At the VFW hall. They're not your team anymore, Simon said, his voice hardening. They're my employees. And they did their job perfectly. They acquired the asset and delivered her to the client's designated holding facility. Contract fulfilled. My involvement is over. The holding facility, Brill said. The farmhouse in Prince William Forest Park. The one with the red clay. Simon's eyes narrowed. You've been busy. He shrugged. Yes. That's the place. A nice isolated spot. Perfect for keeping a package quiet. And the man in charge? The client? Dale Eberhardt, Simon said, confirming the name. The loudmouth with the bad haircut. He's the true believer. He's the one who thinks kidnapping a girl is going to start a revolution. He paid us half up front and half on delivery. The money cleared this afternoon. As far as I'm concerned, Mr. Eberhardt and his package are his own problem now. You armed them, Brill said. You gave a group of fanatics a team of trained killers. I fulfilled a contract, Simon said, his voice cold. I'm not responsible for what the client does after the job is done. That's the beauty of subcontracting, Brill. It's all about plausible deniability. He pushed himself off the car. And now you know. So the question is, what are you going to do about it? I'm going to finish my job, Brill said. Simon laughed. Of course you are. The loyal soldier. You're going to go marching into a farmhouse full of trigger-happy fanatics and a team of my best men, all by yourself. It's suicide. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. Walk away, Brill. This isn't your fight. The girl isn't your problem. Let the FBI handle it. Let them go in loud and get everyone killed. It makes no difference to you. Her father hired me, Brill said. Her father is a butcher who would have you shot for what you did at the Red River if he knew it was you, Simon shot back. There are no good guys in this story. There's just us. And men like us don't die for causes. We die for money. And you've already been paid. Brill just looked at him, his face unreadable. Simon sighed, a sound of genuine frustration. I can see I'm not getting through to you. He pulled his keys out again. All right. You have what you came for. Now get out of my garage before I have my real security team come down here and we have a conversation that's much less pleasant. He unlocked his car. The lights flashed once. Brill didn't move. He just stood there as Simon opened the car door. As Simon slid into the driver's seat, he looked over at Brill one last time. One last piece of professional advice, Simon said. My team is good. But Eberhardt's men, they're true believers. They're more dangerous. A professional killer you can reason with. A true believer will just keep coming until you put him in the ground. He closed the door. The Audi's engine started with a low, powerful growl. Simon put the car in reverse and backed out of the space. He didn't look at Brill again. He just drove away, his taillights disappearing into the darkness of the garage, leaving Brill alone in the silence. Chapter 15. Prince William Forest Park wasn't a park. It was a sprawling, 37-square-mile tract of dense woods and tangled hollows, a place where the suburbs of Northern Virginia finally gave up and surrendered to the wild. It was a place where someone could get lost. It was a perfect place to hide someone who had been found. Brill drove the Explorer down a winding park road, the canopy of old-growth oaks forming a tunnel of green darkness overhead. He wasn't looking for a sign that said, "Kidnapper's Hideout." He was looking at the ground. The red clay Simon had mentioned was everywhere, a thick, rust-colored soil that clung to everything. He found the turnoff a mile from the main park entrance. It wasn't a road, just a narrow, unpaved fire trail, barely wide enough for a single vehicle, marked with a small, faded sign that said private property. The ruts in the trail were deep, churned up by heavy-duty tires. He pulled the Explorer into a thicket of trees, killed the engine, and got out. The silence of the woods was immediate and absolute, broken only by the buzz of cicadas. He didn't walk up the trail. He moved into the woods, running parallel to it, a ghost in the trees. He moved with a hunter's patience, his eyes scanning the ground. He found what he was looking for a quarter of a mile in, a single discarded cigarette butt. A Marlboro Red. Not the kind of thing a park ranger or a hiker would leave behind. It was the kind of careless trash a bored man on guard duty would toss out a car window. He followed the trail for another half-mile. Then the woods opened up, and he saw it. The compound was an old Virginia farmhouse, a 2-story clapboard structure that might have been charming 100 years ago. But it had been given an ugly, modern facelift. A 10-foot chain-link fence, topped with concertina wire, enclosed a 2-acre clearing. A new industrial-sized generator sat next to the house, humming loudly, a diesel-powered heart for the operation. A large satellite dish was mounted on the roof, pointing at the southern sky. And there were cameras, 4 of them, mounted on poles at the corners of the fence. They were cheap off-the-shelf models, but they were watching. Brill found his spot on a wooded hill that overlooked the entire property. It was 300 yards away, close enough to see everything through his monocular, far enough to be invisible. He lay on his stomach in a bed of damp leaves and settled in to watch. Simon had been right. There were 2 distinct species of animal in this zoo. The first species was Dale Eberhardt's American Patriot Front. Brill counted 8 of them. They wore a sloppy mix of camouflage and civilian clothes. They carried an assortment of weapons, hunting rifles, shotguns, a couple of cheap Arkansas 15s. They were the true believers. They were also lazy. One of them, a heavy man with a gut that strained his camo t-shirt, was posted at the front gate. He spent most of his time sitting on a plastic lawn chair, smoking and scrolling through something on his phone. Another 2 were walking the perimeter, but they weren't patrolling. They were ambling, their rifles slung carelessly over their shoulders, talking loudly enough for Brill to hear the murmur of their voices. They were playing soldier. The second species was Simon's professionals. There were 4 of them, the same 4 Brill had seen at the VFW hall. They moved with a quiet, economical grace that was a stark contrast to the Patriots' clumsy bluster. They wore matching dark gray tactical gear. They carried themselves with a coiled stillness. They didn't talk. They communicated with hand signals. They walked the perimeter in the opposite direction of the Patriots, their heads constantly moving, their eyes scanning the tree line. They weren't playing. This was a job. Brill watched the friction between the 2 groups. It was palpable, even from 300 yards away. The Patriots looked at the professionals with a mixture of awe and resentment. The professionals looked at the Patriots with a quiet, undisguised contempt. The 2 groups didn't mix. They occupied the same space, but they lived in different worlds. This, Brill knew, was the weakness. This was the seam he could rip open. He spent the day mapping the compound's rhythm. The guard shift changed at noon. The new shift was just as sloppy as the first. A white, unmarked van arrived at 1:30 p.m. with food. The man from the front gate waved it through without even looking in the back. The generator was refueled at 3 p.m. by one of the Patriots, who spilled diesel all over the ground and then threw his cigarette butt into the puddle. Brill watched, waiting for the flash, but nothing happened. Amateurs. At 4:15 p.m., he saw her. The back door of the farmhouse opened, and two of Simon's men came out. Between them was Amara Okoro. They led her into a small, fenced-in dog run behind the house. It was her exercise time. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pleading. Her face was bruised and she walked with a slight limp, but her head was high. She wore the same expensive clothes she'd had on at the hotel, now rumpled and dirty. She stood in the middle of the dog run, her arms crossed, and stared at her captors with a look of pure, undiluted hatred. She was her father's daughter. Dale Eberhardt came out of the house. He walked over to the dog run, a smug, proprietary look on his weak-chinned face. He said something to her. Brill couldn't hear the words, but he could see the sneer. Amara didn't answer him. She just spat on the ground at his feet. Eberhardt's face went red. He barked an order, and the two professionals grabbed Amara, dragging her back into the house. Brill lowered his monocular. He had seen what he needed to see. The package was alive. And she was a fighter. It made the job harder. And it made it more necessary. He lay there as the afternoon sun began to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the compound. He had all the pieces now. The lazy gate guard. The unsearched delivery van. The blind spot behind the generator. The animosity between the two factions of kidnappers. He began to formulate a plan. It was a high-risk plan, a plan that relied on speed, silence, and the enemy's arrogance. It was a plan for a ghost. He would use their division. He would turn the professionals' contempt and the patriots' incompetence into weapons. He would become a rumor in the dark, a shadow that set one group against the other. As darkness finally fell, blanketing the Virginia woods, Brill pulled back from his observation post. He moved deeper into the woods, to a secluded spot where he could prepare without being seen. He field-stripped his Glock on a flat rock, cleaning and oiling it until the action was silent and smooth. He checked his gear, the garrote wire, the lockpicks, the knife. He was a craftsman, preparing his tools. The compound below was lit by harsh, ugly floodlights. The generator hummed its monotonous tune. The men inside felt safe, secure in their little fortress of hate. They thought the woods were empty. They were wrong. The woods had teeth now. Brill finished his preparations. He stood up, a dark shape in the deeper darkness of the forest. He looked down at the lights of the farmhouse one last time. Then he began to move, not away from the compound, but toward it, a ghost walking into the heart of the fire. Chapter 16. The night pressed in, thick and moonless. Brill moved through the undergrowth bordering the compound, a dark shape flowing through deeper darkness. The harsh yellow glare of the floodlights cast long, distorted shadows, creating a landscape of stark contrasts. The constant throbbing hum of the generator was his ally, a blanket of sound that covered the whisper of his movements. His first target was the fence line, specifically the section near the generator. It was a blind spot. The camera mounted on the corner pole was aimed outward, its cheap lens unable to see the area directly below it. The generator itself, a big, noisy metal box, blocked the view from the house. He lay in the ditch just outside the fence for 10 minutes, watching. The fat patriot at the front gate was still in his lawn chair, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his phone. One of Simon's men was on the roof of the farmhouse, a motionless silhouette with a rifle. The two ambling patriots were making their slow, predictable circle. They were approaching his position. Brill didn't move. He sank lower into the ditch, becoming part of the earth. The two patriots walked past, their boots crunching on the gravel path inside the fence. They were talking about deer hunting. One of them stopped, hawked, and spat a wad of tobacco juice that landed inches from Brill's hiding spot. Then they moved on, their conversation fading into the drone of the generator. Brill waited until they were at the far side of the compound. He took a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters from his bag. The chain-link fence was standard stuff. He found a spot at the bottom, near a fence post where the tension was weakest. He began to cut. He didn't snap the wire. He applied slow, steady pressure, groaning the metal apart. It was quiet work, masked by the generator. A single strand parted with a low twang. Then another. He cut a small, triangular flap at the very bottom of the fence, just big enough to squeeze through. He slid through the opening, a snake moving through a hole in a cage. He was inside. He stayed low, crawling on his belly through the damp grass toward the generator. The ground smelled of spilled diesel, the scent sharp in the night air. He reached the humming metal box and pressed himself against its side. The vibration rattled his teeth. From here, he was invisible to the house, the gate, and the man on the roof. He opened a small panel on the side of the generator. Inside was a tangle of wires and fuel lines. He wasn't going to destroy it. Destruction was loud. He wanted something more subtle. He found the main fuel line, a black rubber hose leading from the diesel tank. He took out his knife. He didn't cut the hose. He made a small, almost invisible slit in the underside, less than a quarter-inch long. It wouldn't leak fast enough to be noticed right away. But over the next hour, air would seep into the line. The generator would start to sputter. It would cough, choke, and then die, plunging the entire compound into sudden, total darkness. It would look like mechanical failure. It would look like the kind of mistake a lazy amateur would make when refueling. Next, the cameras. He followed the power conduit from the generator to the nearest corner pole. He shimmied up the pole, the rough wood splintering under his hands. He reached the cheap plastic housing of the camera, opened it, and simply disconnected the power lead. He did the same at the next pole. He left the other two cameras, the ones at the front of the compound, operational. He wanted the men inside to have a limited, confusing picture of what was happening. He wanted them to feel a false sense of security in the areas they could see, while he owned the darkness everywhere else. His primary work outside was done. Now, it was time to sow the seeds of chaos. He moved toward the back of the farmhouse, keeping to the deep shadows cast by the building itself. He found the two patriots who had been walking the perimeter. They had finished their circuit and were now leaning against the back wall of the house, sharing a cigarette, their rifles propped up next to them. They were complaining about the professionals. "Strut around like they're better than us," the taller one was saying. "Barely say a word. Just give you that look, you know." "I know," the other one said. "My brother-in-law, he was in the army." Said guys like that, the quiet ones, they're the ones you gotta watch. Brill came up behind them like a bad thought. The man on the left was leaning forward to light a fresh cigarette from the butt of the first one. In that moment, his head was down, his attention focused on the tiny flame. Brill's arm snaked around the second man's throat, cutting off his air. At the same instant, he drove the hilt of his knife into the man's temple. Not the blade. The hilt. A hard, focused blow designed to stun, to scramble the senses. The man crumpled without a sound. The first patriot, the taller one, heard the scuffle. He turned, his eyes wide, the cigarette falling from his lips. He opened his mouth to yell. Brill didn't give him the chance. He lunged forward, not with his knife, but with his hands. He grabbed the man's head, his thumbs finding the soft spots under the jawline, and twisted. It was a brutal, silent, and intensely personal act of violence. There was a wet, snapping sound, and the man went limp, his neck at an unnatural angle. Brill lowered the body to the ground, next to his unconscious partner. He looked at his work. One dead, one unconscious. He could have killed them both. But this was better. This was theater. He took the dead man's rifle. He took the garrote wire from his own kit. He moved to the unconscious man and did something that was both a necessity and a piece of psychological warfare. He bound the man's hands and feet tightly with zip ties. Then he gagged him, stuffing a dirty rag from the ground into his mouth and securing it with duct tape. The man would wake up. He would be a witness. Brill looked at the dead patriot. The broken neck was a professional's work. A quiet, hands-on kill. It wasn't the work of a rival patriot with a grudge. It was the work of someone with training. Someone like Simon's men. He dragged the dead body 20 feet away and left it in the open where it would be easily found. He left the bound and gagged patriot in the shadows where he would be found later after the panic had started. He had set the stage. He had created a murder scene. When the lights went out, the patriots would find their dead friend. They would see the manner of his death. And they would look at the quiet, contemptuous professionals who shared the compound with them. They would draw their own conclusions. The right conclusion from Brill's point of view. He slipped away, back into the darkness. He found a spot in the shadow of a large unused woodpile near the side of the house. From here, he could see the back door and the generator. He settled in to wait for the heart of the compound to die. Chapter 17. Brill waited in the absolute darkness of the woodpile's shadow. He was a part of the night, as patient as the stone and the soil. He listened to the steady, monotonous drone of the generator and counted the minutes. The slit he'd cut in the fuel line was a small, precise wound. It wouldn't bleed the machine out quickly. It would give it an embolism, a slow, choking death. It started 47 minutes after he made the cut. The generator didn't just stop. It faltered. The steady hum that had been the compound's heartbeat for hours suddenly developed a cough. A rhythmic hum-chug, hum-chug. The harsh yellow floodlights flickered once, twice, casting dancing, distorted shadows across the clearing. Inside the farmhouse, a light came on in an upstairs window. A man's silhouette appeared. The generator coughed again, a deep rattling sound like a man choking on his own phlegm. The lights flickered violently and then died. Total, absolute darkness. And for a moment, total silence, except for the buzz of the cicadas in the woods. The silence lasted for 3 seconds. What the hell was that? A voice yelled from the front gate. It was the fat patriot. He sounded more annoyed than alarmed. Dale. The damn generator went out again, another voice shouted from the side of the house. A door slammed open on the second floor of the farmhouse. Dale Eberhardt, Minuteman 76, stepped out onto a small balcony. For Christ's sake, Bobby, I told you to check the fuel. Get it started. I did check it, the voice Bobby yelled back defensively. It was half full an hour ago. Flashlight beams began to cut through the darkness, erratic and panicked. The Patriots were fumbling their way through a situation that wasn't in their playbook. Brill saw 3 beams converge on the generator. Well, get it started. Eberhardt commanded from the balcony. I want those lights on. Where's Cletus and Ray? Bobby yelled. They were on perimeter. They were supposed to be back here 10 minutes ago. The flashlight beams began to sweep the back of the yard, bouncing off the walls of the house, the fence line, the trees. They were clumsy, jerky movements. Then one of the beams stopped. It fell on the body of the patriot Brill had left in the open. The man with the broken neck. The man holding the flashlight didn't say anything for a long moment. The beam just trembled. Oh my God, he whispered. The whisper was loud in the sudden quiet. Dale, you better get down here. Eberhardt disappeared from the balcony. A minute later, the back door of the farmhouse flew open, and he ran out, a big maglite in his hand. He ran over to the body, his other men following him, their flashlight beams all converging on the dead man. It's Ray, someone said, his voice cracking. Jesus Christ, what happened to him? Eberhardt knelt beside the body. He reached out a trembling hand and touched his friend's head, turning it slightly. He saw the unnatural angle of the neck. He saw the vacant, staring eyes. He recoiled as if he'd been burned. His neck, Eberhardt breathed. It's broken. This wasn't a gunshot. This wasn't a stray round from a hunting accident. This was something else. Something quiet and personal. "Where's Cletus?" Bobby demanded, his voice high with panic. His flashlight beam swept the shadows. It found the other man, the one Brill had left tied up. He was conscious now, his eyes wide with terror above the duct tape gag, his body writhing uselessly against his bonds. They ran over and cut him free. As soon as the gag was off, Cletus started screaming, a high-pitched, babbling stream of terror. It was them. The quiet ones. "The goddamn mercs," he shrieked, pointing a shaking finger toward the house. They came out of the dark. No sound. No sound at all. They killed Ray. They were gonna kill me. Eberhard stood up, his face a mask of fury and dawning horror. He looked from his dead friend to his terrified one, and then his eyes went to the dark, silent farmhouse. All his righteous, patriotic anger curdled into fear and suspicion. He had invited snakes into his garden, and they had just bitten him. "Those sons of bitches," he snarled. He turned to his men. "Get your rifles. All of you." The professionals had heard the commotion. The back door of the farmhouse opened again. It wasn't a panicked patriot who came out. It was one of Simon's men. He held his rifle at a low ready, a small, powerful flashlight mounted under the barrel. He moved with a calm, fluid grace. "What's going on out here?" he asked, his voice flat, professional. "Why are the lights out?" "You tell us, you bastard!" Eberhard screamed, raising his own rifle. His men did the same, a ragged line of flashlights and gun barrels all aimed at the lone professional. "You killed Ray." The professional didn't even flinch. He just raised his own rifle, the red dot of his sight settling on Eberhard's chest. "You're making a mistake," he said calmly. "The only mistake I made was trusting you." Eberhard shrieked. The back door opened again, and the other three professionals came out, fanning out behind their leader, a perfect fire team. They didn't say a word. They just raised their weapons, their movements synchronized, efficient. The red dots from their sights danced across the chests of the panicked patriots. The compound was a standoff. A Mexican standoff in the dark, fueled by fear, paranoia, and incompetence. It was perfect. While the two factions were locked in their private drama, their attention focused entirely on each other, Brill moved. He slipped away from the woodpile, a shadow detaching from other shadows. The chaos he had engineered was his cover. He didn't go for the back door. That was the center of the storm. He moved along the side of the house, to a small window he'd noted earlier. A bathroom window. It was closed, but it was an old single-pane window with a simple latch. He took a small suction cup from his kit and pressed it to the glass. He used his diamond-tipped scribe to score a neat circle in the pane around the latch. A sharp tap with the hilt of his knife, and the circle of glass came free with a soft click, held by the suction cup. He reached through the hole, unlocked the latch, and slid the window open without a sound. He pulled himself up and through the opening, landing as softly as a cat on the tiled floor of a small, dark bathroom. He was inside. The house smelled of fried bacon, stale beer, and unwashed men. From outside, he could still hear the shouting match, the escalating threats. He ignored it. It was just noise now. He opened the bathroom door a crack and peered out. He was in a downstairs hallway. A flight of stairs led up to the second floor. At the end of the hall, he could see the faint, flickering light of a television. Someone was still inside, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their own backyard. Brill drew his suppressed Glock from its holster. The weight of it was solid, reassuring. He took a breath, let it out slowly, and stepped out into the hallway. Chapter 18. The shouting match in the backyard was escalating. Brill could hear Eberhard's voice, high and cracking with a mixture of rage and fear, and the calm, contemptuous replies of Simon's man. It was the perfect soundtrack for what he had to do. It meant every ear, every eye was focused on the drama outside. He moved down the hallway, a wraith gliding over the worn floorboards. The flickering light at the end of the hall came from a small den. The room was dominated by a big screen television, its volume turned down low. A man was sitting in a sagging armchair, his back to the door, a shotgun resting across his lap. He was one of Eberhardt's men, a patriot left inside to watch the package. The man was engrossed in what was on the screen. It was an old black-and-white war movie, something with John Wayne. Men were storming a beach, yelling, dying heroically. The patriot in the chair was captivated, living a fantasy of clean, noble violence while a messy, real version of it was brewing in his own backyard. He was an amateur, in every sense of the word. Brill stepped into the doorway. The man didn't notice. The floorboards didn't even creak under Brill's weight. He took in the scene. The shotgun across the man's lap was a problem. If the man startled, his finger could twitch. A shotgun blast inside the house would bring the whole bloody soap opera crashing in on top of him. He needed to be faster than a nervous twitch. He moved into the room, circling around the armchair, staying in the man's blind spot. The man sighed contentedly as John Wayne threw a grenade. He took a long swallow from a can of beer, resting on the floor next to him. Brill was right behind the chair now. He could smell the man's sweat, the faint scent of gun oil. He didn't use his pistol. He didn't use his knife. He used his hands. His left hand shot out, clamping over the man's mouth, muffling any sound. His right hand grabbed the shotgun, twisting it away, its wooden stock scraping against the armchair. The man's body went rigid with shock and surprise. He tried to stand to fight, but Brill's weight was on him, pressing him down. Brill drove his knee into the man's side, just below the ribcage, a hard, focused blow. The air whooshed out of the man's lungs in a silent gasp. Before he could recover, Brill shifted his grip and drove the hard edge of his palm into the man's temple. It was the same stunning blow he'd used on the patriot outside. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he went limp, unconscious. Brill lowered him gently to the floor, taking the shotgun. He propped the man up against the chair, making it look like he'd fallen asleep watching the movie. He took the man's radio from his belt. It was a cheap walkie-talkie, not the professional gear Simon's men used. He switched it on, turned the volume all the way down, and put the earpiece in his ear. He left the den and continued through the house. The place was a pigsty. Dirty plates were piled in the sink. Empty beer cans and pizza boxes littered the kitchen table, right next to a gun cleaning kit and a scattering of loose rifle rounds. It was the home of men who believed they were at war, but lived like lazy college kids. He found the cellar door in a short hallway off the kitchen. It was a heavy, solid oak door, old and reinforced with a new, heavy-duty deadbolt. A professional addition to an amateur setup. Simon's touch. A single chair was placed next to the door. Another guard post. This one was empty. Brill listened. He could hear the shouting from outside, but he could also hear something else. A low murmur from behind the cellar door. A voice. He put his ear to the wood. He couldn't make out the words. It was a man's voice, calm and reassuring. Then another sound. A soft sob. Amara. And one of her guards. Brill looked at the deadbolt. It was a high-quality Schlage. Picking it would take time, make noise. He needed a key. He scanned the hallway. The guard who was supposed to be in the chair wasn't here. Had he gone outside to join the argument? Or was he somewhere else in the house? Brill heard a toilet flush from a bathroom at the end of the hall. He flattened himself against the wall in the shadows next to a coat rack. A moment later, the bathroom door opened. The man who came out was another patriot, this one younger, with the wispy beginnings of a beard. He was zipping up his pants. He had a key ring with a single large brass key hanging from a carabiner on his belt loop. The kid saw the empty chair by the cellar door and frowned. "Frank," he called out softly, "you go for a smoke." He didn't get an answer. He started to look nervous. He pulled the walkie-talkie from his belt. "Frank, you there? What's going on with all that yelling outside?" He was about to key the mic when Brill stepped out of the shadows. The kid saw him and his eyes went wide. He fumbled for the pistol on his hip, his movements clumsy and panicked. Brill crossed the distance in 2 strides. He didn't go for the kid's gun. He went for the kid. He slammed him against the wall, the impact knocking the wind out of him. The kid's head hit the dry wall with a dull thud. Brill's hand shot out and ripped the radio from the kid's grasp before he could press the transmit button. His other hand grabbed the front of the kid's shirt, bunching it in his fist. "The key," Brill said, his voice a low whisper colder than the grave. The kid stared at him, his mouth agape, terror turning his face into a pale, sweaty mask. "Don't make me ask again," Brill said. The kid's hands trembled as he fumbled with the carabiner on his belt. He unclipped the key ring and held it out. Brill took it. He looked at the kid, at the fear in his eyes. He could kill him. It would be the clean, simple thing to do. But a dead body was a problem. An unconscious one was just a man who had fallen asleep on the job. He drove his fist into the kid's stomach. The kid doubled over with a choked gasp. As he fell, Brill brought his knee up, catching him squarely on the point of the chin. The kid's head snapped back and his eyes went blank. He slid down the wall to the floor in a boneless heap. Brill stood over him for a second, listening. The shouting match outside was still going strong. The movie was still playing in the den. No one had heard a thing. He took the key and walked to the cellar door. He slid the heavy brass key into the Schlage deadbolt. It turned with a smooth, well-oiled click. He turned the knob on the door. It was unlocked. He opened the door a crack. A sliver of dim yellow light spilled out from below, along with the smell of damp earth and something else. Fear. He could hear the voice more clearly now. It was one of Simon's men, the leader of the 4-man team. His voice was calm, professional. "No reason to be afraid," the man was saying. "Just a disagreement among the hired help. It will be over soon." Brill gripped his pistol, the suppressor a cold, dense weight on the end of the barrel. He pulled the door open silently and started down the old wooden stairs into the darkness below. Chapter 19. The cellar stairs were old wood, steep and narrow, and they groaned under Brill's weight. Each step was a potential betrayal, a sound that could cut through the shouting match in the yard and the calm, professional voice below. The air grew colder as he descended, thick with the smell of damp earth, mildew, and the faint metallic tang of fear. He reached the bottom and paused in the shadows. The cellar was a small, stone-walled box, lit by a single bare bulb hanging from a wire. The light was weak, casting long, dancing shadows. A stained mattress lay on the floor in one corner. In the center of the room, Amara Okoro sat on an upturned plastic bucket. Her hands were tied in front of her with a zip tie, and her face was a mask of pale, defiant anger. Standing a few feet away from her, his back to the stairs, was the leader of Simon's team. He was the one Brill had seen giving orders at the VFW hall. He was tall and lean, dressed in dark tactical gear, his rifle held at a low ready. He was talking to Amara, his voice a calm, reasonable murmur, the kind of voice a doctor uses to explain a terminal diagnosis. "A simple business transaction, that's all this is," the professional was saying. "Your father understands business. He'll meet their price. You just need to remain calm." "My father doesn't negotiate with terrorists," Amara said, her voice shaking but laced with her father's iron will. "Or their hired help." The professional almost smiled. "We're not terrorists, Ms. Okoro. We're consultants. There's a difference." He had a radio on his shoulder, and he reached up to adjust the volume, turning it down to better hear any instructions. He was focused on his job, on managing his asset. He wasn't expecting a threat from behind. That was his mistake. Brill moved. He came off the last step like a drop of water falling from a leaky pipe, silent and inevitable. The professional must have felt a change in the air pressure, a flicker in the dim light. He started to turn, his body tensing, his rifle beginning to rise. He was fast. Very fast. Brill was faster. He didn't go for the man's gun. He went for the man. He drove the butt of his suppressed Glock forward in a short, brutal jab, not to shoot, but as a blunt instrument. The hard polymer slammed into the man's kidney. The professional grunted, his breath exploding from his lungs, his body folding instinctively around the point of impact. As the man doubled over, Brill's other hand came up, grabbing the man's head, his fingers digging into his eye sockets. He used the man's own forward momentum, pulling him down and twisting, slamming his face into the stone wall. The sound was a wet, ugly crunch of breaking bone and cartilage. The professional collapsed to the floor without another sound, his rifle clattering on the stone. He wasn't dead. But he wasn't getting up again, for a very long time. Brill stood over him for a second, listening. The shouting outside was still a chaotic backdrop. Nothing had changed. He turned to Amara. She was staring at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She had just watched a ghost appear out of the shadows and dismantle her captor with a savage, silent efficiency. She didn't know if he was a rescuer or just a new monster. Brill raised a single finger to his lips. Quiet. He knelt and picked up the professional's rifle, an expensive Heckler & Koch carbine. He checked the magazine. It was full. He slung it over his shoulder. He took the man's radio, a high-end encrypted model, and clipped it to his belt. Then he took a knife from the man's vest and walked toward Amara. She flinched as he approached, pressing herself back against the damp stone wall. Brill knelt in front of her. He didn't say a word. He just took her bound hands and with a quick, precise cut, severed the zip tie. Amara rubbed her wrists, her eyes never leaving his face. Who are you?" she whispered. "A problem for them," Brill said, his voice a low rasp. "A solution for you. We're leaving." "My father, did he send you?" "Yes," Brill said. It was the simplest answer. He stood up and offered her a hand. She hesitated, looking from his impassive face to the unconscious man on the floor. "How do I know I can trust you?" "You don't," Brill said. "But he's your only other option right now." He nodded at the groaning professional. "And he's not getting up. Your choice. You can stay here and wait for his friends to find him, or you can come with me." The radio on Brill's belt crackled to life. It wasn't the cheap walkie-talkie from the Patriot. It was the professional's radio. The voice that came through was calm, cultured, and familiar. It was Simon. "Victor, report," Simon's voice said, clear and sharp despite the static. "What is the situation on the ground?" "The client is becoming erratic." Brill looked down at the man on the floor. "Victor." He had a name. "Victor, do you copy?" Simon's voice demanded, an edge of impatience creeping in. "Give me a sitrep now." Brill looked at Amara. Her eyes were wide. She had heard the voice. She understood. The clock was now ticking. Loudly. Brill keyed the mic on the radio. He didn't try to imitate Victor's voice. He just held the transmit button down for 3 seconds, flooding the channel with the dead air of the cellar. It was a signal. A sign of trouble. It would tell Simon more than any words could. He unclipped the radio and tossed it into the darkest corner of the cellar. "Time to go," he said to Amara. He took the Glock from his holster. It looked huge and deadly in the small, dim room. He held it out to her, butt first. She stared at it. I've never shot a gun before." "It's easy," Brill said. "You point it at anyone who isn't me, and you pull the trigger. You pull it until they stop moving. Can you do that?" She looked from the gun to his cold, unblinking eyes. She saw no comfort there, no reassurance. Just a hard, brutal reality. She took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded, her hands trembling as she took the weapon. "Good," Brill said. He took the shotgun he'd left at the top of the stairs. He worked the pump action. The shuck-shuck of the slide a loud, definitive sound in the quiet cellar. "Stay behind me. Don't make a sound. And do exactly as I say." He turned and started up the stairs, the shotgun held at the ready, moving back up into the heart of the house, where the chaos he had unleashed was about to boil over. Chapter 20. Brill came up the cellar stairs with the shotgun held tight against his shoulder, the pump action smooth and ready. Amara followed a step behind, her knuckles white where she gripped the Glock. She held it with two hands, the way he'd shown her in a silent 30-second lesson in the cellar, but it still looked alien and heavy in her grasp. The shouting from the backyard had reached a fever pitch, a chorus of threats and accusations that covered the sound of their ascent. They emerged into the narrow hallway off the kitchen. The house was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and impending violence. The kid Brill had knocked out was still a heap on the floor, but the guard from the den, the one who'd been watching John Wayne win the war, was gone. The sagging armchair was empty. "Where did he go?" Amara whispered, her voice a thin thread of sound. "Stay close," Brill said. He didn't need to tell her twice. He moved toward the kitchen, using the doorframe as cover. He peered around the edge. The kitchen was empty, a disaster scene of pizza boxes and dirty dishes. The back door, which led to the yard, was closed. Through its window, he could see the chaos outside, a cluster of flashlight beams dancing and jerking, men screaming at each other over the hoods of pickup trucks. A floorboard creaked on the second floor. Brill froze. He looked up at the ceiling. Someone was up there, and they were moving. He pulled back from the kitchen doorway, pressing himself and Amara against the wall. He pointed upward with the barrel of the shotgun. Amara's eyes followed his, wide with a new kind of fear. The enemy wasn't just outside anymore. They were in the house with them. The walkie-talkie on the unconscious kid's belt crackled to life. "Frank? You up there? What the hell is going on? I heard something." It was the voice of Bobby, one of the patriots from outside. There was no answer. "Frank, damn it, answer me." Bobby's voice yelled from the radio, tinny and panicked. The footsteps upstairs stopped directly above them. Then a new sound. The slow, deliberate click-clack of a round being chambered into a rifle. Brill grabbed Amara's arm and pulled her into the den, the room with the television. The war movie was still playing, the sound of fake gunfire, a surreal counterpoint to the real tension in the house. He pushed her down behind the big sagging armchair. "Don't move," he whispered. "And don't make a sound." He took up a position by the doorway, the shotgun ready. He could hear the man upstairs moving again, this time toward the stairs. He was coming down. Brill heard the first step creak. Then the second. The man was moving slowly, cautiously. He wasn't a panicking patriot. He was a hunter. It had to be Frank, the guard from the den. He must have heard the commotion from the cellar and gone upstairs to investigate, or to get a better vantage point from a window. Now he was coming back down to a house that had changed while he was gone. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. A shadow fell across the hallway floor. Frank stepped into view, a big man with a beer gut and a hunting rifle held awkwardly in his hands. He looked confused, his head turning from the empty kitchen to the dark hallway. "Billy?" he called out softly, using the name of the kid on the floor. "You down here?" Brill waited. He let Frank take another step into the hall. He let him see the unconscious form of his friend by the bathroom door. Frank saw him. He stopped dead. "What the?" Before he could finish the thought, Brill stepped out from the den doorway. Frank wasn't a professional, but he had a hunter's reflexes. He saw Brill and the shotgun at the same time, and he reacted. He brought his own rifle up, his movements clumsy but fast. Brill didn't give him the chance to aim. He fired the shotgun. The sound inside the enclosed hallway was apocalyptic. It wasn't a bang. It was a physical blow, a roar of thunder that shook the cheap plaster on the walls and blew out the television screen in the den. The blast hit Frank square in the chest, a solid mass of buckshot that lifted him off his feet and slammed him back against the staircase, painting the wall behind him in a wet crimson spray. He slid to the floor, his rifle clattering on the wood. The house was suddenly, shockingly silent. The war movie was dead. The shouting outside had stopped cold. The shotgun blast had been a final, definitive statement that had cut through all the other noise. Then the shouting started again, but it was different now. It was panicked. Gunshot. Inside the house. Who's in there? It's a trap. They're in the house. Brill knew he had seconds. He grabbed Amara's hand and pulled her up from behind the chair. She was shaking, her face white, her eyes fixed on the dead man by the stairs. "We have to move," Brill said, his voice hard, pulling her toward the kitchen. "Now." He kicked open the back door. The scene in the yard was chaos. The two factions, the patriots and the professionals, had forgotten their argument. They were all looking at the house now, their rifles raised, their faces lit by the bobbing beams of their flashlights. They were a confused, disorganized mob, and for a moment they were all pointing their guns at the same place. Brill shoved Amara out the door ahead of him. "The workshop. That gray building. Run." He didn't give them a chance to think. He raised the shotgun and fired again, this time into the air. The blast echoed through the clearing. He worked the pump, ejected the spent shell, and chambered a new one. Amara was running, stumbling across the uneven ground, her eyes fixed on the dark shape of the workshop 50 yards away. A few of the patriots, recovering from their shock, started firing at them. Their shots were wild, panicked, kicking up dirt around Amara's feet. Brill stepped out onto the back porch, making himself a target. "Hey!" he yelled. He fired the shotgun again, this time aiming at the big floodlight on the corner of the house. The light exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging half the yard into deeper shadow. That's when Simon's men reacted. They weren't panicked. They were professionals. They saw the threat. They saw their client's men firing wildly, and they saw their payday running across the yard. 3 of them opened fire, not at Brill, but at the patriots. They were creating a corridor of fire, suppressing the amateurs to protect the asset. A patriot screamed as a burst of automatic fire tore into his leg. Another one dropped his rifle and ran for the cover of a pickup truck. The standoff had become a 3-way firefight. It was a swirling, confused mess of muzzle flashes and shouting. Brill used the chaos. He ran from the porch, following Amara, zigzagging across the yard. He could hear the snap of bullets passing his head from both sides. He reached the workshop and threw open the door, pushing Amara inside and diving in after her, just as a line of bullets stitched across the wooden door where they had just been. Chapter 21. The workshop smelled of gasoline, sawdust, and old iron. It was a cavern of shadows, cluttered with the ghosts of abandoned projects. A half-restored tractor, a rusted engine block hanging from a chain hoist, workbenches littered with tools. The only light came in strobing, violent flashes from the firefight raging outside, painting the grimy windows with bursts of orange and white. Brill slammed the heavy wooden door shut and threw the bolt, a thick rusted piece of iron that slid home with a satisfying thud. Bullets hammered the outside of the door, splintering the wood, punching holes that let in slivers of the chaotic night. Amara was pressed against the wall, her back to the door, her hand still gripping the Glock. Her knuckles were bone white. She wasn't crying or screaming. She was breathing, fast and shallow, her eyes wide, trying to process the storm of noise and violence she'd just run through. "They're shooting at each other," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "For now," Brill said. He moved away from the door, deeper into the workshop's shadows. "That won't last. Once they figure out we're not on either side, they'll both be shooting at us." He moved to a side window, a pane of glass so dirty it was almost opaque. He scraped a small patch clean with his thumb and peered out. The yard was a madhouse. 2 of the patriots were down. One of Simon's men was leaning against a truck, clutching his arm. The firefight had devolved into a series of panicked exchanges from behind cover. Dale Eberhardt was screaming orders that no one was listening to. Brill scanned the workshop. His eyes landed on a dark green pickup truck parked near a large roll-up garage door. It was a Ford F-150, about 10 years old, with a dented fender and a ladder rack. It was ugly. It was perfect. "That's our way out," he said, nodding toward the truck. Amara looked at it. "We don't have the keys." "We won't need them," Brill said. He moved toward the truck, but a new sound cut through the chaos outside. A man's voice, amplified by a bullhorn. It was Dale Eberhardt. "Cease fire." Eberhardt's voice boomed, tinny and distorted. "Cease your fire, damn it. They're in the workshop. The girl is in the workshop." The shooting sputtered and died. A tense, ringing silence fell over the compound, broken only by the groans of a wounded man and the distant hum of the still-dead generator. "Well," Brill said softly. "So much for the confusion." He knew what was coming next. They would surround the workshop. They would call for him to surrender. And when he didn't, they would turn the wooden building into Swiss cheese. "They have us trapped," Amara said, her voice trembling slightly. "They think they do," Brill said. He looked at the truck again, then at the large roll-up door. He started moving toward a workbench. "They've given us a gift. A moment to think." He rummaged through the clutter on the bench, pushing aside greasy rags and old spark plugs. He found what he was looking for: a heavy-duty trouble light with a long extension cord, a can of engine starter fluid, and a roll of duct tape. "What are you doing?" Amara asked, watching him. "Creating a new problem for them to solve," Brill said. He worked quickly. He took the trouble light and smashed the bulb, leaving the hot filament exposed. He taped the can of starter fluid, which was highly flammable, to the trouble light, aiming the nozzle directly at the filament. He ran the extension cord toward the back of the workshop, plugging it into a wall outlet. He didn't turn it on. He just left the switch on the cord dangling. "The man in the house," Amara said suddenly. The one with the shotgun. "Did you have to kill him?" Brill didn't look up from his work. "Yes." "Why?" "Because he was in the way," Brill said, his voice flat. He finished his contraption and looked at her. "This is not a world of polite conversation, Ms. Okoro. In this world, there are obstacles, and there are tools to remove them. Right now, I'm the tool. He was the obstacle." Before she could respond, Eberhardt's voice came through the bullhorn again. "You in the workshop. This is Dale Eberhardt, of the American Patriot Front. You have an asset that belongs to U.S. Send the girl out now, and you will be granted a soldier's mercy." Brill almost smiled. A soldier's mercy. From a man who ran a failing print shop. "What do we do?" Amara asked. "We let them get comfortable," Brill said. He moved to the Ford F-150. He opened the driver's side door, reached under the dash, and pulled out a tangle of wires. He took out his knife and began to strip two of them, a red one and a yellow one. Outside, a new voice joined the conversation. It was one of Simon's men, the team leader. His voice was calm, professional, and carried easily without a bullhorn. "Eberhardt, shut up. You're not in charge here." "The hell I'm not." Eberhardt's voice shrieked back. "This is my operation. My men are dead because of you." "Your men are dead because they're incompetent," the professional replied coolly. "Now be quiet and let me handle this." There was a pause. To the man inside, "You have made a professional mistake. You have trapped yourself. But you have kept the asset alive. That is worth something. We can negotiate." Brill ignored them. He finished stripping the wires. He looked at Amara. "Get in the truck. Passenger side. Get on the floor, and don't get up until I tell you to." She hesitated for a second, then did as he said, scrambling into the truck's dusty cab. Brill walked back to the dangling switch for the extension cord. He took a deep breath. He listened. He could hear them moving outside, taking up positions surrounding the building. They were getting ready for a siege. He flicked the switch. For a second, nothing happened. Then there was a bright flash from the front of the workshop, followed by a loud whoosh. The can of starter fluid had erupted, spraying a jet of flaming liquid across a pile of oily rags and sawdust. The fire caught instantly. It wasn't an explosion. It was a sudden, ravenous blaze. Dry wood and old oil went up with a roar. Thick, black smoke began to pour from the front of the workshop. "Fire!" someone screamed outside. "The whole damn place is on fire." The disciplined siege dissolved back into panicked chaos. Brill ran to the truck. He slid into the driver's seat, the smell of the fire already filling the workshop. He touched the two bare wires together. The engine sparked, turned over, and roared to life. He slammed the truck into gear. He didn't go for the side door. He aimed the truck directly at the large corrugated metal roll-up door at the front of the workshop. "Hold on," he yelled to Amara. He stomped on the accelerator. The old Ford leapt forward, its tires screaming on the concrete floor. It hit the roll-up door at 30 miles an hour. The sound was a cataclysmic shriek of tearing metal. The door buckled, ripped from its tracks, and the truck burst out of the workshop and into the clearing, into the middle of the chaos. They were surrounded by fire and smoke, and men with guns. Eberhard stood directly in their path, his mouth agape, his bullhorn forgotten in his hand. Simon's men were diving for cover. Brill didn't slow down. He drove straight at the main gate. Chapter 22. The Ford F-150 hit the night like a battering ram, bursting from the smoke and fire of the workshop into the chaotic clearing. Dale Eberhard stood frozen in the headlights, a deer caught in the glare of his own failed revolution, his mouth agape, the bullhorn dangling uselessly from his hand. Brill didn't swerve. He didn't slow down. He aimed the truck's heavy steel grille directly at the leader of the American Patriot Front. At the last possible second, Eberhard's survival instinct finally kicked in. He shrieked and dove out of the way, tumbling into the dirt as the truck roared past, its tires churning up gravel and spitting it across the yard. "The gate!" Amara yelled from the floor of the cab, her voice tight with a mixture of terror and adrenaline. "It's closed." Brill saw it. The main gate was a heavy, reinforced steel barrier, probably installed by Simon's team. The Ford would crumple against it like a beer can. He wrenched the wheel hard to the left, away from the gate, aiming for the fence line. The maneuver caught everyone by surprise. Simon's men, who had been diving for cover from the fire, were now scrambling to get a firing angle. The Patriots were just firing wildly, their bullets punching holes in the night. The truck fishtailed on the loose gravel, its old suspension groaning in protest. Brill fought the wheel, his knuckles white. He wasn't aiming for the fence itself. He was aiming for the post where the cheap chain link met the corner of the farmhouse. The weakest point. "Hold on," he yelled again. He stomped on the gas. The truck hit the corner post at 40 miles an hour. The sound was a sickening shriek of tortured metal and snapping wood. The post ripped free from the house. The fence peeled back, the concertina wire uncoiling like a nest of angry snakes. For a moment the truck was hung up, its tires spinning uselessly. Then with a final violent lurch it tore free, and they were out, off the compound's grounds, and onto the narrow unpaved fire trail that led back to the park road. The rearview mirror was a kaleidoscope of chaos. The workshop was a roaring inferno, casting flickering demonic shadows across the clearing. Men were running, shouting. Headlights flared to life. Two of them. A black SUV, Simon's men, and a rusty Ford Ranger, the one Eberhard had driven to the VFW hall. They were coming. "They're right behind us," Amara said, pulling herself up onto the passenger seat. She still had the Glock, holding it in a two-handed grip, pointed at the floor. "I know," Brill said. He pushed the old Ford as hard as it would go, the truck bouncing and bucking on the rutted trail, the branches of overgrown trees scraping and clawing at the windows. The trail was a dark, narrow tunnel, and he was flying through it blind, his headlights cutting a frantic, bouncing path ahead. The black SUV was gaining on them. It was a modern vehicle, with better suspension and more power. Its headlights were bright and steady in the rearview mirror, pinning them. "The one behind us," Brill said, his eyes flicking from the road to the mirror. "That's the professionals. They'll be disciplined. They'll try to disable us." As if on cue, the passenger side window of the SUV rolled down. The barrel of a rifle emerged. A single precise shot rang out, and the Ford's back window exploded inward, showering the cab with shattered glass. Amara screamed and ducked, covering her head. "They're shooting at the tires," Brill yelled. He swerved violently, sending the truck into a controlled skid. The next shot went wide, thudding into a tree. "Can you shoot that thing?" Brill asked, nodding at the Glock in her hands. I don't know," she stammered. "Point it at the headlights behind us and pull the trigger," he said, his voice hard. "Don't aim. Just make them duck." She hesitated for a second, her face pale in the dashboard lights. Then she took a deep breath, leaned out the shattered back window, and fired. The sound of the pistol was sharp and loud inside the cab. She fired again and again, emptying the magazine in a frantic, panicked burst. The shots were wild, but they had the desired effect. The rifle barrel in the SUV disappeared. The headlights swerved as the driver reacted. It bought them a few seconds. They burst out of the fire trail and onto the paved park road. Brill didn't hesitate. He cranked the wheel to the right, away from the park entrance, deeper into the dark, winding roads of the forest. The SUV followed, its tires squealing on the pavement. Behind it, Eberhardt's rusty Ranger came flying out of the trail, fishtailing wildly before straightening out. "We have two of them now," Amara said, reloading the Glock with a fresh magazine from Brill's bag, her hands shaking but her movements surprisingly steady. She had found a core of her father's steel within herself. "Good," Brill said. "That's better for us." He saw a fork in the road ahead. He slammed on the brakes, the old truck skidding sideways, and cranked the wheel, taking the left fork, a smaller, less maintained road that plunged down into a dark hollow. The professional driver in the SUV was too good. He anticipated the move, braking smoothly and following them down the narrow road. But Eberhardt, in his beat-up Ranger, wasn't a professional. He was an angry man driving too fast. He tried to make the turn, but his tires lost their grip. The Ranger slid straight through the intersection, its horn blaring, and disappeared down the right fork. "One down," Brill said. He had split his pursuers. Now it was just them and the pros. The road narrowed further, the pavement giving way to gravel. It was a winding, treacherous path along the edge of a steep hill. A mistake here would send them tumbling into the darkness. The SUV was right on their tail, its headlights filling their cab. The rifle appeared in the window again. This time, the shooter was patient. He wasn't aiming for the tires. He was aiming for the driver. A round punched through the metal of the tailgate. Another tore through the back of the cab, passing between Brill and Amara with a vicious snap. "Get down," Brill yelled. He saw a sharp, hairpin turn coming up. It was too tight to take at this speed. But he had no choice. He hit the brakes hard, throwing the truck into a four-wheel drift. The tires screamed in protest, skidding on the loose gravel, the rear of the truck swinging out over the dark abyss. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought they were going to go over. He wrenched the wheel, stomped on the gas, and the tires bit. The truck lurched, straightened out, and shot forward around the turn. The SUV behind them tried to follow the move. But their heavier vehicle, with its higher center of gravity, couldn't handle the turn. It slid too wide. The driver overcorrected. The SUV's passenger side wheels went off the edge of the road. The vehicle tilted, hung there for a second, and then tumbled over the side, disappearing into the darkness with a final, fading scream of tortured metal. Brill didn't slow down. He didn't look back. He just kept driving, his hands locked on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. They drove in silence for 5 minutes, the only sound the roar of the damaged engine, and the wind whistling through the shattered back window. Did we lose them?" Amara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We lost that one," Brill said. He rounded another bend, and his headlights fell on a new set of lights. Headlights. Parked in the middle of the road, blocking their path. It was Eberhardt's Ford Ranger. He had circled around on the other road and was waiting for them. And standing in front of the truck, framed in the headlights, was Dale Eberhardt himself, holding a shotgun. Chapter 23. Dale Eberhardt stood in the middle of the gravel road, a scarecrow silhouette framed by the headlights of his own truck. He held the shotgun, a double-barreled antique like a man who had seen it done in movies. He was trying to look resolute, a patriot making his last stand. He just looked scared. Brill didn't slow the battered F-150. He didn't brake. He kept his foot steady on the accelerator. "What are you doing?" Amara yelled from the passenger seat. "He's going to shoot." "Yes, he is," Brill said calmly. Eberhardt raised the shotgun to his shoulder, squinting into the glare of Brill's headlights. He was a man blinded by his own trap. "Get out of the truck," Eberhardt screamed, his voice thin and cracking. "Get out now." Brill kept coming. 50 yards. 40. The shotgun boomed, a flash of orange in the night. The blast was high and to the left, a spray of buckshot that shredded the leaves of an oak tree 10 feet from the truck. Eberhardt had flinched, closing his eyes at the moment he pulled the trigger. An amateur's mistake. "He missed," Amara breathed. "He won't miss again," Brill said. He flicked a switch on the dashboard. The headlights went out. The road was plunged into absolute disorienting blackness. For Eberhardt, who had been staring into two suns, the world would have vanished. He was blind, his night vision completely destroyed. Brill stomped on the brake. The Ford skidded to a halt, its tires groaning on the gravel, 20 yards from Eberhardt's roadblock. The engine coughed and died, the silence rushing in to fill the void. "Stay here," Brill said. He opened his door without a sound and slipped out into the darkness. "Where are you going?" Amara whispered. "To an empty cab." Brill moved in a low crouch, circling wide into the woods. He was a shadow moving through other shadows, his feet making no sound on the damp earth. He could hear Eberhardt fumbling with his shotgun, trying to break it open and reload in the dark. The sound was clumsy, metal scraping against metal. "I know you're out there," Eberhardt shouted into the woods, his voice tight with panic. "Show yourself. Face me like a man." Brill kept moving. He came up behind Eberhardt's Ford Ranger. The engine was still running, the taillights casting a faint red glow. He could see Eberhardt's shape now, a dark silhouette against the slightly less dark night. He was still standing in the middle of the road, shotgun held at a shaky ready, trying to pierce the darkness with his inadequate eyes. Brill didn't use his gun. He picked up a rock from the side of the road, about the size of his fist. He tossed it into the woods, on the opposite side of the road from where he stood. It landed in a patch of dry leaves with a loud skittering sound. Eberhardt spun toward the noise, bringing the shotgun up. "Who's there?" he shrieked. While Eberhardt was distracted, Brill closed the distance. He came up behind him with the silent, final purpose of a falling stone. Eberhardt must have sensed him at the last second, a primal feeling of being hunted. He started to turn. Brill swung the rock. It wasn't a wild, angry blow. It was a short, precise, economical arc that ended at the base of Eberhardt's skull. The sound was a dull, wet thud, like a melon breaking. Eberhardt collapsed without a sound, a puppet whose strings had been cut, his shotgun clattering on the gravel. Brill stood over him for a moment, listening. The woods were silent. He walked over to the Ranger, got in and backed it up, turning it around. He drove back to the F-150. Amara was still in the passenger seat, her eyes wide, the Glock held tight in her hands. "Get in," Brill said, leaning over. She scrambled out of the wrecked truck and into the passenger seat of the Ranger. She didn't look at the body lying in the road. Brill put the truck in gear and drove away, leaving Dale Eberhardt, the leader of the American Patriot Front, alone in the darkness with his failed revolution. They drove for an hour, sticking to back roads, heading east. They didn't talk. Brill found what he was looking for, in a small sleeping town just off Route 1. A motel called the Sleepy Hollow Inn. It was a single-story, L-shaped building with a flickering neon sign and a parking lot that held more weeds than cars. It was perfect. He parked the Ranger at the far end of the lot, away from the other two cars. He paid for the room in cash, using the money he'd taken from the dead patriot at the farmhouse. The man behind the plexiglass window was half asleep and didn't even look up from his crossword puzzle. The room was what Brill expected. 2 beds with thin, clean sheets. A bathroom with a shower that probably had 2 settings, ice cold and scalding. A television bolted to the wall. It was anonymous. It was safe. Brill locked the door and slid the chain across. Amara stood in the middle of the room, looking lost. The adrenaline had worn off, and she was left with the bone-deep weariness of a survivor. "There's a first aid kit in my bag," Brill said, nodding toward the duffel he dropped on one of the beds. "You have some cuts on your face." She touched her cheek, her fingers coming away with a smear of dried blood. She hadn't even realized she was bleeding. She went to the bag and found the kit. She took it into the small bathroom and closed the door. Brill heard the water run. He took out the satellite phone and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back an inch. He could see the road, the parking lot. He dialed a number from memory. It connected on the first ring. "Yes," Carver's voice said. No greeting. "The package is secure," Brill said. "Condition?" "Intact." "Scared." "But intact." "And the opposition?" Carver asked. "Neutralized," Brill said. It was a clean, simple word for a messy, complicated night. "Excellent," Carver said, a hint of satisfaction in his dry voice. "The client is anxious. He wants the handover as soon as possible." "Give me a time and a place," Brill said. "Stand by. I'll have a location for you within the hour. It will be secure. Private." "Make sure it is," Brill said, and ended the call. The bathroom door opened. Amara came out. She had washed her face. The cuts were small, superficial, but they stood out against her pale skin. She had taken off her torn and dirty blouse and was wearing the t-shirt she'd had on underneath. It made her look younger, more vulnerable. She sat on the edge of the bed opposite him, wrapping her arms around herself. "What happens now?" she asked. "We wait," Brill said. "A car will come. It will take you to your father." She was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the motel's ancient air conditioner. "Those men, the ones at the farmhouse," she said finally, her voice low. "Why did they do it? They kept talking about patriotism, about saving America. How is kidnapping me saving America?" "They needed an enemy," Brill said, still looking out the window. "Your father was a convenient one. You were a symbol." "A symbol," she repeated bitterly. "I felt like an animal in a cage." She looked at her hands. "The man in the cellar. The one who was talking to me. He was one of them, wasn't he? The professionals." "Yes." "He was polite," she said, struggling with the word. "He brought me water. He told me it was just business. And you came in and—" She trailed off. "He was an obstacle," Brill said, repeating his earlier words. He turned from the window and looked at her. For the first time, he saw past the warlord's daughter, past the asset, past the package. He saw a young woman who had been dragged through hell and was trying to make sense of it. "His job was to keep you there. My job was to get you out. We had a professional disagreement." She looked at him, really looked at him, her eyes searching his face for some flicker of emotion, some hint of the man behind the ghost. "And you," she asked softly. "Are you just a tool? Is that all you are?" Brill didn't answer. He just held her gaze. The air in the cheap motel room was thick with unspoken questions, with the fragile, tentative beginnings of something that felt almost like trust. It was a trust born not of comfort or kindness, but of shared violence and survival. His satellite phone buzzed on the table, a harsh, insistent sound that shattered the moment. He picked it up. It was a text message, a set of coordinates, and a time. Chapter 24. The coordinates led them to Manassas, to a regional airport that catered to corporate jets and men who measured their wealth in flight hours. At 5:30 in the morning, under a sky the color of dishwater, the place was a ghost town. The main terminal was dark. The only signs of life came from a private aviation hangar set far back from the main road, a massive, windowless white box sitting alone on a sprawling apron of concrete. Brill turned the Ford Ranger onto the service road that led to the hangar. A black SUV with diplomatic plates was parked across the road, blocking it. Two men in dark suits stood beside it. They were Carver's men, the same kind of anonymous, interchangeable parts who had driven him from the airport. One of them held up a hand. Brill stopped the truck. The man walked over, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses despite the pre-dawn gloom. He glanced at Brill, then at Amara in the passenger seat. He gave a curt, professional nod. "The package is confirmed," the man said into his wrist mic. He stepped back and waved them through. Brill drove past them toward the hangar. The massive hangar door was open a crack, spilling a clean white light onto the dark tarmac. He drove the Ranger inside and killed the engine. The sudden silence was immense. The hangar was vast and sterile, the floor so clean you could see your reflection in it. In the center of the space sat a single aircraft, a Gulfstream G650, the same one that had brought the Akoros to America. Its engines were quiet, but it had a latent power, a feeling that it could be in the air and halfway across the ocean in a matter of hours. Standing near the wing of the jet were three men. President Jomo Okoro was in the center. He had changed into a fresh suit, dark and perfectly tailored. He looked rested, powerful, every inch the statesman. To his right stood Colonel Jallo, his arms crossed over his thick chest, his face a mask of stone-cold hostility. The third man was another Kandin guard. They stood perfectly still, watching the truck. Brill got out. He didn't look at Okoro. He looked at the hangar, at the exits, at the two men Carver had posted by the main door. He was mapping the space, assessing the threats. Amara got out of the truck on her side. She stood there for a moment, a small, solitary figure in the vast, empty space. She looked at her father. Okoro's face broke into a wide, brilliant smile. It was a performance, a piece of theater for an audience of one, but the relief in it was real. He strode forward, his arms open. "Amara," he said, his voice booming with a manufactured warmth that echoed in the hangar. She ran to him. She didn't run like a daughter running to her father. She ran like a survivor reaching a rescue boat. She crashed into his arms, burying her face in his expensive suit, her shoulders shaking with the silent, racking sobs she had held back for days. Okoro held her, patting her back, murmuring to her in their native tongue. He looked over her head, at Brill. The smile was gone. His eyes were cold, appraising. It was the look of a man inspecting a tool that had performed its function. Brill stood by the door of the truck, his hands empty, his face giving away nothing. He was an observer now. The transaction was almost complete. After a long moment, Okoro eased his daughter away from him, holding her at arm's length. He looked at the bruises on her face, the cut on her cheek. His expression hardened. "The men who did this to you," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "They will pay. I promise you this." He led her toward the jet, his arm protectively around her shoulders. Jallo fell into step behind them, his eyes never leaving Brill. As they reached the stairs of the Gulfstream, Amara stopped. She turned and looked back at Brill, who hadn't moved. Her father tried to urge her up the stairs, but she pulled away from him gently. She walked back across the concrete floor, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She stopped in front of Brill. She was no longer the terrified girl from the motel room. She was composed, her father's daughter in bearing, but her eyes were her own. I never learned your name, she said softly. I don't have one, Brill said. The man in the cellar. My father, he hires men like that, she said, her voice barely a whisper. And he hires men like you. I don't understand the difference. He was paid to keep you, Brill said. I was paid to get you back. That's the only difference. She looked at him for a long time, searching for something in his impassive face. No, she said finally. That's not the only difference. She reached out and her fingers brushed his arm, a light, fleeting touch that was shockingly warm against his skin. Thank you, she said. Then she turned and walked back to the jet without looking back. She climbed the stairs and disappeared inside. President Okoro stood at the top of the stairs. He looked down at Brill. The mask of gratitude was back on, a perfect, seamless performance. You have done what you were paid to do, Okoro called out, his voice resonating in the hangar. My country is in your debt. My banker has been instructed to wire the balance of your fee. You will find it is substantial. Brill just nodded. A man of few words, Okoro said with a chuckle. I appreciate that. Discretion is a rare and valuable commodity. He gave a final, regal nod. Goodbye, Mr. Ghost. He turned and disappeared into the jet. Colonel Jallo gave Brill one last look, a look that was a promise of future violence, before following his president inside. The jet door sealed with a heavy pneumatic hiss. Brill stood there as the ground crew, who had been waiting discreetly in the shadows, moved in to pull the chocks from the wheels. The jet's engines began to whine, a low hum that grew into a powerful roar. The job was done. The package was delivered. It was a clean victory. He turned his back on the plane, on the warlord and his daughter, on the whole bloody affair. He started walking toward the hangar door, toward the waiting Lincoln, toward the anonymity of the highway. He didn't look back. He just walked. Chapter 25. Brill walked across the vast, sterile floor of the hangar, his boots making no sound. The roar of the Gulfstream's engines was a physical presence at his back, a wave of heat and power that he was leaving behind. The job was done. The money was wired. It was a clean extraction, a textbook success. He walked toward the hangar door, where the black Lincoln and Carver's two quiet men were waiting to ferry him back to a world of anonymous motels and burner phones. He was 20 feet from the door when it slid shut with a heavy, grinding finality, plunging the hangar into the stark, artificial glare of its overhead lights. The roar of the jet engines outside was suddenly muffled. Brill didn't stop walking, but his posture changed. The easy post-mission stride was gone, replaced by a coiled stillness. His eyes flickered to Carver's two men. They hadn't moved. They stood by the now closed door, their hands at their sides, their faces impassive behind their dark glasses. They were statues, and they were blocking his exit. He stopped. He turned slowly. The ramp of the Gulfstream, which had been closing, hissed and lowered again. President Jomo Okoro stood at the top of the ramp. The mask of the grateful statesman was gone, stripped away to reveal the cold, hard face of the warlord underneath. He wasn't smiling. Colonel Jallo stood beside him, a massive, brutal shadow, and this time Jallo was smiling. It was a predator's smile, full of teeth. A final piece of business, Mr. Ghost, Okoro called out, his voice sharp and clear, cutting through the low hum of the hangar. Brill didn't answer. He just stood there, a solitary figure in the center of the vast floor, flanked by Carver's men at his back and Okoro's men on the plane. He was in a box. He had walked right into it. Okoro walked down the ramp. He moved with a new purpose, a confident, menacing swagger that he had kept hidden in Washington. Jallo and two other guards followed, fanning out as they reached the hangar floor, their movements practiced and professional. They were herding him. Amara appeared in the doorway of the jet. She looked from her father's hard face to the scene on the hangar floor, her expression confused, a line of worry creasing her brow. "Father," she said, "what is this?" Okoro ignored her. He stopped 20 feet from Brill. "I am a man who believes in paying his debts," he said, his voice dangerously soft. You have returned my daughter to me. That was one debt. It has been paid. He took a step closer. But I have other debts. Older ones. Brill remained silent. His eyes moved constantly, assessing. 2 of Carver's men behind him. 4 of Okoro's in front. The odds were long. The exits were closed. I asked my sources about you, Okoro continued. After I requested your services, I wanted to know who this ghost was. It took some time. You have covered your tracks well. But the world is small, and money talks very loudly. He paused, letting the silence stretch. It told me about a man who fought in the jungle. A man who was part of a group called Executive Options. From the corner of his eye, Brill saw Carver's men shift their weight. They weren't just blocking his exit. They were part of the cage. Carver had sold him out. Or more likely, the fee Okoro's banker had paid to the firm was for 2 services, 1 retrieval and 1 delivery. I believe you know the name Simon, Okoro said, his eyes boring into Brill. A South African devil who took money to prop up a corrupt regime. And I know the name of the mercenary who killed my brother at the Battle of the Red River. Amara, still on the jet's ramp, gasped. She looked from her father to Brill, her face a mask of dawning horror and disbelief. Father, no, he saved me. He saved you because he was paid to, Okoro snapped, not taking his eyes off Brill. That was a contract. This is justice. He looked back at Brill. My brother was a good man. He was going to be the future of my country. And you, a man with no name, no country, no soul, you shot him from 1,000 yards away and left him to die in the mud. Brill's face was stone. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He just stood there, letting the accusation settle in the cold, still air of the hangar. It was true. He had been young, arrogant, and very good at his job. He had taken a contract, sighted in on a target, and pulled the trigger. He'd never known the target's name. He'd never cared. It was just a job. Another ghost, in a long line of them. You are a war criminal, Okoro said, his voice ringing with a righteous fury that was 20 years old. And you will stand trial for your crimes. In my country. Before my people. He gave a sharp, clipped order in his native tongue. Jallo and his men moved in. They didn't hesitate. They moved like a wolf pack, surrounding him, cutting off any chance of escape. Brill didn't fight. He didn't reach for a weapon he no longer had. He stood his ground. To fight here was to die here. And Brill wasn't ready to die. Not yet. He watched them come, his mind cold, clear, already processing the new reality, the new mission. The mission was no longer about escape. It was about survival. Jallo was the first to reach him. He drove the butt of his rifle hard into Brill's stomach. The air exploded from Brill's lungs in a grunt of pain. Before he could recover, another guard kicked his legs out from under him, sending him to his knees on the hard concrete. Amara cried out from the ramp. Father, stop. You can't do this. Okoro turned to her, his face a mask of cold fury. This man is a murderer. He is a ghost from a past I have worked my entire life to bury. He does not deserve your sympathy. He turned back to watch as Jallo's men hauled Brill to his feet. They twisted his arms behind his back with brutal efficiency, the pain sharp and electric. They bound his hands with a zip tie, pulling it so tight it cut into his wrists. Take him to the plane, Okoro commanded. They began to drag him across the floor, his boots scraping on the clean concrete. He didn't struggle. He just walked, his head held high, his eyes scanning everything, memorizing the faces of the men holding him, the layout of the jet, the look on Okoro's triumphant face. As they passed the wing of the jet, he looked up at Amara. She was standing on the ramp, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes filled with tears of horror and confusion. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. In his there was no fear, no pleading. There was nothing. He was a ghost again, a man already looking past the present, toward the next move on a board that had just been violently overturned. They dragged him up the stairs and into the luxurious cabin of the Gulfstream. They threw him into a seat and strapped him in. Jallo stood over him, a cruel, satisfied smile on his face. "The flight to Kando is long," the colonel said softly. "We will have much time to talk about the old days." The heavy door of the jet swung shut, sealing with a pneumatic hiss that cut off the outside world. The lights in the cabin brightened. The engines, which had been idling, spooled up into a deafening roar. Brill leaned his head back against the soft leather of the seat. He felt the plane begin to move, taxiing away from the hangar. He closed his eyes. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a prisoner. A package. A piece of blood ransom being delivered to a man who had waited 20 years for his revenge. The plane turned onto the runway, its engines screaming as it gathered speed, lifting off into the gray morning sky, leaving America behind. To be continued. Don't miss a single action-packed declassified files from the Shadowboxer series. Let me send you conscripted for free. Accept your mission. Deep Dive. Deception Tide. Miami Mirage. Cuban Crossfire. Canvas Code. Weapons Grade. Mojave Mirage. Weapons Free. Danger Close. Devil's Rope. Blood Ransom. Ghost Coup. True Nature. Burn Bag. False Flag. Credible Threat.